Welcome back everyone, it's Eric from Rare Candy, and it's that time again. We have another new set almost upon us, so today I'm going over my thoughts for the next Sword and Shield expansion and our full Darkness Ablaze set review. So Darkness Ablaze is comprised of cards from Japan's Eruption Walker and Infinity Zone sets, as well as from a handful of different starter decks. But I do have to confess though, I did originally want this video up a bit earlier, but a big challenge for this set review in particular was the fact that Pokemon is actually withholding a number of cards that would normally be likely inclusions, such as the now cut Gardevoir VMAX and Dreadnought VMAX we recently learned about. They also have opted to include some of the cards from the recent Japanese starter V decks, but not all of them. So all of this really made piecing together the potential set list quite challenging for me, and there's actually one regular Pokemon V that is likely unaccounted for that comes from one of those starter decks, as well as one trainer card in this set review that will be cut. But just at the time of recording, we have no way of knowing which one, so that's kind of my disclaimer. There might be a couple of card tweaks to the final set list that aren't reflected in my review. But there's still a lot we do know about the set. Darkness Ablaze is giving us 185 plus new cards, including a variety of new Pokemon V and VMAX, including some exciting new support for dark Pokemon in particular, like the name of the set would suggest. And to make it easier on you guys, I put timestamps in the description below so you can jump to any card you want to hear about. But with that being said, sit back, get comfortable, and let's check out what Darkness Ablaze has in store for us. Alright guys, to kick things off, we are going to be looking at a Pokemon VMAX right away. We are going to be looking at the Butterfree VMAX evolution line. But before we get to the VMAX, we do need to, of course, look at the base form Butterfree V. So Butterfree, 190 HP basic, fire weakness, 1 retreat cost. Has 2 different attacks, the first of which for a grass energy, your opponent's active is now poisoned and confused. And then the second attack for 2 grass and a colorless is 130. Nothing too special, but we do need to, of course, check out our pre-evolutions attacks before we look at our final evolution. Sometimes they do come in handy. The first attack is probably the better of the two here, just because the confusion and poison could get in some chip damage, maybe buy you a turn of being safe from an attack. But overall, Butterfree V, not too special. Butterfree VMAX, on the other hand, is going to be a much tankier Pokemon, coming in at 300 HP, though that is a little bit on the lower side of some of the VMAXs we've seen so far. But this one does have a free retreat, which is also really nice. I do like that. And it just has 1 single attack here. For 2 grass and a colorless is 150, and your opponent's active Pokemon is now poisoned and confused. So effectively, once you factor in the poison damage, you're hitting for 160, which is honestly kind of a magic number in terms of two-shotting things in the format. Most of the VMAXs are going to have, somewhere around 310, 320 HP. Some are going to be a little beyond that. But generally speaking, this is going to two-shot most everything, making this kind of an okay attack. Now, the big thing I don't like about this, however, is the fact that it doesn't one-shot like basic Pokemon V, whereas, a lot of the other VMAXs we've seen that have these sort of two-shotting attacks, a lot of them can hit above the 200 damage range, while not quite reaching like VMAX numbers. Butterfree unfortunately can't do that, so even against 2 prizers, you're still kind of having to two-shot them, which feels, a good bit worse, unfortunately. The other thing we do need to sort of contend with here is going to be the grass energy cost. Of course, we do have Rillaboom in the format right now, but I have to say, if I'm playing a VMAX with Rillaboom, I feel like Rillaboom VMAX is probably just a bit better than Butterfree to begin with. I think if we're playing Butterfree over something like Rillaboom, we're really going all in on the fact that we are doing status conditions, and we really want to double up on that in some capacity. So I think if we are playing this, we're probably playing like the Rose engine to get powered up, or maybe some copies of Turbo Patch, and opting to save that other deck space for other cards that can sort of take advantage of these annoying status conditions. Of course, we do have things in the format like Toxicroak to increase our poison damage, and there's other things like some of the fossils like Cradily that can make it so that Pokemon with status conditions can't retreat. There's even, I remember at one point, a deck idea floating around from a prominent Japanese player who is talking about playing Butterfree with Amistar and Cradily both and sort of going down that route. So I think that's an option. Again, I don't think we're playing Rillaboom with Butterfree. I think generally speaking, Rillaboom VMAX is just better. Hits harder. It can even knock out basic Pokemon V, has more HP. It has a bigger retreat cost, but generally speaking, I think the pros outweigh the cons. And Butterfree in general just doesn't seem too great right now. I mean, luckily we do have Rose to help get this thing powered up. But I have to say, at a glance, this is definitely one of the weaker VMAXs we've seen up till this point. So, I mean, being a 300 HP Pokemon just in and of itself that can two-shot everything does inherently have some degree of value. But I just think compared to the other VMAXs, there's not much intent to play Butterfree over them. So for that reason, while I don't think Butterfree is actually a bad card, considering the other similar options, I think they sort of push Butterfree out of the space of being a genuine consideration for competitive players. So I'm going to downvote, despite you still being able to build around this. I mean, we'll actually probably still do a video on Butterfree eventually as well. You can successfully build around this. You can probably win some games with it. But again, just compared to the other VMAXs we have access to, there's not much of a reason to play Butterfree over the other ones. 3 new cards we're going to talk about all together here are going to be the new Monkey Trio that is getting printed in the set that is going to include Semi-Sage, Semi-Seer, and Semi-Poor. So we've had historically a ton of these bad sort of monkey cards being printed over the years, but I do think these are some of the better ones we've actually seen ever since they came around back during Black and White. But all of these we're looking at for basically the same secondary attack they have. All these Pokemon are different types, but they have that second attack for 3 colorless energy is 110, and then the Pokemon can't attack next turn. And we're discussing all these together because they all kind of fill a similar role here. All of these can attack for a triple acceleration energy, or just in general have some flexibility in terms of how they want to get powered up. Since they do all attack for a colorless attack cost, that means we can power them up with other things like Welder if we choose to as well. And the fact that we're hitting for 110 is a pretty decent number too. With weakness, you're going to one-shot pretty much any of the base form Pokemon V or non-tag team GXs that might still exist that are weak to you. So what's nice about this is that you can actually pretty easily play these types of cards in your deck if you already have some degree of energy acceleration. You know, maybe you are a fire deck and you want some nice type coverage against some of those water Pokemon. You can play Semi-Sage, though I do know the more recent water Pokemon are lightning weak predominantly, not grass weak. But just as an easy example to kind of highlight what we're talking about here, guys. Or if you are a grass deck and you're weak to fire, you can play Semi-Poor to counter that sort of weakness. So I do like the fact that there is a toolbox of these different sort of Pokemon that potentially include in your deck that you can power up for just one attachment, potentially with a triple acceleration energy. I think the big thing ultimately that is going to make me sort of downvote these cards, despite being able to get powered up pretty easily, is the fact that we are losing Ditto. So that means you have to actually commit space to the entire evolution line for one of these stage 1 attackers, making them a little less splashable than they would have been pre-rotation. So I think that's definitely a big hindrance. But you never know, guys. You know, we have a lot of different triple acceleration energy based attackers. So maybe there is a world where we play just a big sort of stage 1 or, you know, one prize counter deck, and these cards could theoretically become good options for that sort of scenario. But for the moment, I'm not too impressed. I think these are cards to sort of have your eye on, but for the moment, they don't really look too great. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Decidueye card coming out in Darkness Ablaze. Decidueye, of course, is a stage 2, 140 HP, fire weakness, 2 retreat cost, has an ability which is definitely the selling point of this particular card. You prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon V and Pokemon GX, so Safeguard is back. It was only a matter of time before we got an ability like this that would pertain to Pokemon V, so definitely happy we are starting to get some more V hate in the format. But then Decidueye does have an attack of its own as well. For a grass and colorless, does 90 damage, and this attack does 20 to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So needless to say, this attack is nothing too special, but luckily with these styles of cards we've seen in the past, whether it's been the more recent Hoopa, whether it's been Sigilyph, Suicune, even Wobbuffet, going all the way back to the original EX era, none of these cards have really had amazing attacks, but that's kind of because they don't really need to. You know, when you're walling against all of the prominent cards in the format, it doesn't really matter how many turns it's going to take you to attack, because you're eventually going to win if your opponent doesn't have any answers to these types of cards anyways. So the attack, not even really too relevant. 2 energy attack cost is fine. Kind of a bummer we are losing counter gain and the rotation. That would have definitely helped you get up and running a little bit quicker. But I mean, we still have other things like the Tapu Koko Prism Star sort of package to get Decidueye up and running a little bit quicker if you do lose one in one turn. So that is kind of nice. But of course, really, as long as we get these things up and running, we're going to be in a good spot. Now, the Decidueye is a little bit different from some of these other Pokemon we've had in the past because, of course, this is a Stage 2. So unlike something like Hoopa of the past, you can't just bench this thing and be good to go. You actually have to take your time and evolve with things like Rare Candy and such with your Rowlets. And that kind of opens Decidueye up to being a little bit weaker than some of these other sort of safeguard style Pokemon we've had in the past. You know, if you have a slow start, you can just get your Rowlet knocked out turn 1 or turn 2, and that's the game sometimes, which does make Decidueye a little bit worse in that respect, unfortunately. But nevertheless, guys, I still think there's a world where we're playing Decidueye, just because all of the prominent attackers right now are basically Pokemon V, Pokemon GX, with a couple of exceptions. You know, pre-rotation, there are some things like Baby Blacephalon still running around, though I do think there are easy counters you could put in your list to sort of accommodate those styles of decks if you really want to. But overall, I mean, this ability, once you get this up and running, not too many decks have an answer to this. I mean, Dragapult has Shred. That's one of really the only sorts of decks that can get around something like this. But generally speaking, most of the Pokemon V and VMAX decks aren't going to have a great answer to Decidueye, and they are going to have to start coming up with answers of their own if they do want to potentially play around this. So even though this is a little bit clunkier to get up and running than these other styles of Pokemon, I still like Decidueye. I mean, guys, you know me, I'm a little bit soft sometimes on these stage 2s and these set reviews, but I still think Decidueye is good. These abilities have historically been great. We still have things like greens if you really want to get your Decidueyes up and running a little bit easier. We have Rosa. So I still see a world where this thing gets up and running kind of like normal. And once you do, I think you're going to be in a good spot. So overall, guys, I'm a fan of Decidueye. It doesn't hit the hardest, but I think this ability is so good, it's going to kind of carry it, despite it being a stage 2, despite its mediocre damage output. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at some more Pokemon V and GX hate, and that is going to be Glycopod. So unlike Decidueye, Glycopod is a stage 1, has 130 HP, fire weakness, 2 retreat cost, and also unlike Decidueye, the GX and Pokemon V hate is going to be much more offensive with this guy. So just for 2 colorless energy, it does 30, plus 50 more for each of your opponent's Pokemon V and Pokemon GX in play. And then it does have one other attack for grass, 2 colorless 70, and you switch this with one of your bench Pokemon. So this second attack, definitely not too special, but this first attack is an absolute beast of an attack here. So just to run through the math, if your opponent has a full field of Pokemon V and GX, you're going to be hitting for 330 damage, and that's going to knock out even most Pokemon VMAX that are going to be out there as well. Now, granted, guys, I mean, if your opponent's smart and they see you're playing Glycopod, they're probably not going to overbench if they're a good player. But nevertheless, I mean, sometimes you have to bench that extra Dedenne, that extra Crobat V, just to get set up, and I mean, that adds up for Glycopod here. And that's not even factoring in Eternatus VMAX, which we are getting in this set, which can have a bench of 8 potentially. So I think this attack is actually very, very good. The issue is I'm not actually sure how you are building around Glycopod. I don't think you can actually successfully build around this first attack, because if you're only playing Glycopods and like some Jirachis just as an example, your opponent can see that and they can just bench only like 1 or 2 Pokemon and then just knock out your Glycopods and go on with their day. So if you are playing Glycopod, I do think you would be needing to play this in addition to other attackers in your deck. I think realistically, Glycopod would only probably be like a 2-2 line or maybe like a 3-3 line at most in your deck, just because, again, building around this sets up your opponent to where they can play around it. So what the attackers are that you'd be playing Glycopod with, I think that's still kind of up in the air. Unfortunately, with this particular set review, we are sort of talking in the context of post-rotation, and we are not yet in that format, so we really don't have a clear idea of what decks we are going to be countering the most. You know, are there going to be any strong non-Pokemon V and GX decks that we'll need to take into consideration? It's a little bit early to tell at this point to see exactly what the meta is going to be. So unfortunately, guys, I don't have the best answer for you on that one. Twin energy based decks really haven't been much of a thing ever since Rebel Clash, but you have to think you can play this card in any deck that uses twin energy, triple acceleration energy, even other things like Rillaboom, welder based decks, etc. Anything with energy acceleration could theoretically run something like this. So I think in terms of the best partners for this, we will have a better idea once the post-rotation meta starts to take a little bit more of a solid form, but for right now, it's kind of up in the air. But nevertheless, guys, I think this card is still solid, even though your opponent can play around it. You can pair it with potentially other twin energy based attackers and ensure that single prize decks don't shut you out of the game. So for that reason, I'm going to stand by Glycopod, even though its future isn't too clear right now. I think its first attack is stupid strong, especially when we look at things in the past like Megalopony and Jigglypuff GX and how many decks were running that for a while. So overall, I'm going to stand with this card. I think it's pretty decent. Next up, guys, we have the first Fire Pokemon VMAX we're going to be looking at in the set review, and that is going to be Big Daddy Charizard VMAX himself. I know everyone was excited to see how they would represent Charizard in the Sword and Shield era of the game. So let's take a look at this thing, see how it's going to do. So before we get to the VMAX, we do need to look at the base form Charizard V. So it's a basic 220 HP, water weakness, 3 retreat cost. Nothing particularly noteworthy so far, but I guess the HP is on the slightly better side for a base form V. But its first attack does 80 damage for 3 energy, and its second attack for 2 fire and 2 colorless is 220, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So actually the second attack is kind of decent. 220 is a pretty good number to hit, in all honesty. You're going to knock out basically any of the non-tag team Pokemon GX running around, any of the base form Pokemon V. So I actually think that damage is pretty decent that we have there. But then going ahead and looking at Charizard VMAX here, first attack for 3 colorless energy does 100, and that second attack for 3 fire and 2 colorless does 300 damage, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. Kind of as usual with Charizard, we always kind of expect it to get these huge, just giant, like nuke-like attacks. You know, historically in the game, Charizard's been pretty bad in the TCG, despite having these huge, monstrous attacks. But Charizard VMAX, I think, is kind of decent here. It does help that Charizard V is also decent in its own right. But 300 is a pretty good number to hit for. The one issue I do have with it, though, it is a little bit short of taking one-shots on some of the Pokemon VMAX that are circulating around. So if you do want to knock out opposing VMAXs, you are going to need additional damage modifiers. I think some of the more reliable ones we're going to have are going to be something like a combination of Vitality Band and maybe even Galarian Zigzagoon. Those seem like probably the most consistent, least like deck space intensive options we could potentially go down if we wanted to. Because most of the VMAXs have around 320. Of course, some do have 310. But 320 is sort of an average amount that we want to be hitting for. So with Vitality Band and 1 Galarian Zigzagoon, or a Galarian Zigzagoon with a Scoop Up Net, you can hit those magic numbers. So hitting for 300 plus damage is definitely good, but we have to acknowledge the fact this thing has a 5 energy attack cost, which is pretty nuts. I mean, luckily though, as you guys know, Fire has pretty solid energy acceleration. We have Welder right now still in the format. We still have the Volcanion from Unbroken Bonds to use as well. And I think that's sort of the package I would initially be looking to start testing with if I was going to attempt to build around this. Being able to go second and get that 3 energy flare starter off to get your Charizards powered up seems really, really nice. I like that. And from there, just using Welder turn after turn to keep energies in play is gonna kind of get you where you need to go. I don't think you need too many fancy tricks to make this happen. One thing is worth pointing out though is the fact that Charizard VMAX is of course an evolution. So that means we can actually have used triple acceleration energy, turning that 5 energy attack into effectively a 4 energy attack. And what's really nice about that too is the fact that you can actually use the single triple acceleration energy to pay for the 2 energy discarding side effect that the attack otherwise sort of imposes on you. So if I'm building around Charizard VMAX, I think I'm probably including a handful of triple acceleration energies. Probably not 4. 3 seems like probably a sweet spot, because more than likely if you're using this attack, you're probably never using it more than 3 times in the game, because anything that has 300 hit points is giving up multiple prizes anyways. So I think that's sort of a, sort of a skeleton deck idea you could build around. So of course, guys, I mean, there is no shortage of solid fire Pokemon that are always competing for space in your welder-based decks. But Charizard VMAX having 330 HP, hitting for 300 plus damage, I think makes kind of a decent case for the card. So I think for right now, I'm going to upvote Charizard VMAX. Is it going to be better than just the sort of 2 prize and 1 prize, all basic welder variants or baby stuff on? That remains to be seen. Again, especially guys, I want to reiterate, we are not yet in the post-rotation format at the time of recording, but just kind of looking ahead at what the format might look like right now, I think Charizard VMAX does look pretty promising. Next up, we have Hound Doom V. Hound Doom V is a basic fire Pokemon, 210 HP, water weakness, and 1 retreat cost. Has this first attack for just a single fire energy is 20, and your opponent's active is now burned. And its second attack for 2 fire and a colorless does 100 plus 100 more if any of your fire Pokemon have damage counters on them. So the first attack we have here is fine. It's effectively 40 for 1, just a nice little bit of chip damage. And the second attack is also like kind of okay. Like hitting 200 for 3 on a fire Pokemon is pretty easy to do. Like with just a welder and a single attachment, you can get this up and running. But the issue I have with this is that you almost have to build around Hound Doom V. This isn't like a splashable fire attacker you can just throw into your welder box, firebox decks out there. Just because a lot of the time those Pokemon are getting knocked out in one hit, and you're not going to have a great chance to really capitalize on this style of attack. I think if I'm powering up another basic Pokemon V or GX, I think I'd rather just power up a Cramorant or a Ninetales V or a Heatran GX, even though we can build around this attack, and I think actually get it set up pretty consistently. It sort of locks you into this Hound Doom strategy. So if we do want to accommodate this attack cost, there are some different things we could do. We could play like a Jinx Spirit Tomb sort of engine to move damage counters to our fire Pokemon. We are unfortunately losing Rainbow Energy in the rotation, so post-rotation, this attack becomes even harder to get powered up. I think pre-rotation, you can make a bit of a better case for Hound Doom, but post-rotation, this gets a little bit more awkward to get powered up. And there is a new stadium that can help put damage counters on your Pokemon, but if you're playing the new Spike Myth Stadium, that means you're not playing a giant Hearth in play. And all of this at the end of the day is just to do 200 damage. You know, if we're having to sort of go all in around a very specific strategy in a fire deck, I'd rather kind of just play the Charizard VMAX we just looked at. Or I'd rather just play the normal sort of welder box, firebox sort of deck that we've seen for a while now. Just because you can play a variety of different fire attackers and you don't have to build your entire deck around this one specific attack. And while 200 is decent, it's not good enough to warrant building your entire strategy around this. I just don't think this is going to be the most bang for our buck that we could get if we are trying to build a welder-based deck out there. So while I don't think this is an inherently awful card, I say this in every set review, fire Pokemon just have so much other competition. To be a fire Pokemon that actually sees play, you really have to be exceptionally strong because there is so much competition to take up those other 56 cards in your deck that aren't welder. So for that reason, guys, I'm going to downvote Hound Doom. It's not an awful card, but again, I think it just gets outclassed by other fire Pokemon that already exist. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at a new Blazekin card. Blazekin is a stage 2 Pokemon, 170 HP, water weakness, and 2 retreat cost. So definitely one of the tankier Blazekins I think we've had. This actually might be the tankiest of all the one prizes we've had up until this point. But it has this ability, this Pokemon is both fire and fighting type. And then its attack here for a fire and 2 colorless does 130, and you attach a basic energy from discard to one of your benched Pokemon. So I think this card is actually pretty interesting because being fire and fighting type is actually pretty good in terms of the different Pokemon that you're going to hit for weakness. You know, up until this point, Metal Pokemon have been running rampant. Zacian has been one of the absolute best cards we've had ever since it came out back in Sword and Shield. Blaziken makes quick work of that, especially with Metal Frying Pan rotating out of format. They won't really be able to protect against their weakness as well, which means Blaziken's going to make quick work of those unless your opponent has a variety of other sort of damage reduction modifiers like Lucario Melmetal, Metal Goggles, etc., etc. But most of the time, we are going to just be knocking out Zacian Vs on any given day. But more interestingly, I think the fact that your fighting type is honestly a little bit better. We have Pikarom in the format, though I do think Pikarom is going to take a huge hit after the rotation goes into effect. So we might not see that as much, but we are getting a very strong new fighting weak Pokemon coming out in the set. Of course, that is going to be Eternatus VMAX. A lot of the dark Pokemon are still weak to fighting despite some of them having their weaknesses changed. And Eternatus is definitely one of the most hyped new cards, and Blaziken being able to just hit into it, doing 260, even though it's not knocking it out, that's still putting a big dent in this 3 prize Pokemon that is coming out. And there's still a variety of other fighting weak Pokemon like the Dedenne GX, which is still going to see play after rotation, as well as the new Crobat V, which most decks are also going to be playing. So there's no shortage of different fighting weak Pokemon that we want to hit for weakness. So I think actually the type combo here is really good. There are a lot of different cards that benefit each type. So of course, fire Pokemon have Welder, they have Giant Hearth, and fighting has other things like Karate Bell, Martial Arts Dojo, etc. Now, unfortunately, we are losing Diancie in the rotation, and I think Diancie being gone is actually kind of a big deal, unfortunately, for the math on certain things. But to be honest, guys, I don't think we're really playing this for any of the fighting support. I think if we're building around Blaziken, we're probably actually playing with fire energies and some copies of twin energy as well, because you really don't need Welder with a deck like this, because all you have to do is, once you get your first Blaziken set up, you can attach a fire to your next Blaziken, and whenever your active one goes down, you attach another twin energy to your next one. And you just sort of keep chaining your attackers in that fashion. So I think you can get this thing up and running. I don't really think that's the issue with this card. It just kind of suffers from a lot of the same stuff that other Stage 2 Pokemon sort of suffer from. You know, unlike something like Decidueye, it doesn't have a great ability that shuts out like 75% of the decks in the format, as an example. And a lot of cards can really make quick work of a card like this. You know, one prize decks like Baby Cephalon, Spirit Tomb, etc. I think can run through something like Blaziken. Basically, any deck that plays ADP is going to be able to make quick work of this as well. If Dragapult still manages to hang around even after Eternatus releases, Dragapult's going to eat Blaziken for breakfast as well. So I definitely think Blaziken has some challenges if it does want to succeed. So I think for me, even though I think we can build a functioning deck around Blaziken, like it has all the pieces it needs to sort of just exist as a deck, I don't think what it does is actually strong enough to make this a competitive card. So for that reason, I'm actually going to downvote this, though I think there is a world where, due to its typing, I think in a very specific metagame, like for a small tournament like a League Challenge, a League Cup, something like that, where you sort of know the meta, if everyone in your area is playing Pikarom, just as an easy example, play Blaziken. You can probably win. But at a larger scale event with a wider field, I don't think this card has nearly as much of a chance. So for that reason, guys, I do have to downvote Blaziken, despite in a vacuum it being kind of a decent card. Next up, guys, we have our other fire Pokemon VMAX of the set, and that's going to be Centiskorch VMAX. So of course, before we get to the VMAX, we do need to look at the base Centiskorch V. So of course, this is going to be a basic 210 HP, water weakness, 3 retreat cost, has 2 different attacks, the first of which for a fire energy, you may discard 1 energy from this Pokemon. If you do, choose 1 energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon and discard it. And then its second attack for 4 fire, just a vanilla 180. So I actually do like the first attack that we have here because, again, you kind of just want to buy time until your Centiskorch VMAX gets up and running. And putting them a manual attachment behind is actually pretty good. I do think this is a solid little attack, and actually does synergize a little bit well with the VMAX. But getting onto Centiskorch VMAX, this card gets a little bit more interesting. VMAX, of course, 320 HP, water weakness, 3 retreat cost, and then it has a single attack for 2 colorless energy. It does 40 plus 40 more for each fire energy attached to this Pokemon, and you may attach a fire energy from discard pile to this Pokemon after calculating damage for this attack. And luckily for fire types, just in general, they are one of the better types when it comes to just dumping energy in play and continuously building up a bunch of energy on the field. Of course, we do have Welder right now. We still have things like Rose coming out in this same set as well, so you can potentially pursue an engine with that sort of strategy as well. But I think generally speaking, your deck list for Centiskorch is going to look pretty vanilla, to be honest, guys. You're probably playing maybe some copies of Jirachi, or even greens. I think you could go down that route as well. And just play some copies of Volcanion as your sort of starter to get a bunch of energies on your Centiskorches, and just build up these big Centiskorch VMAXs and just bulldoze anything in front of you. So with 7 to 8 energy, you can knock out pretty much basically anything in the format. I know it seems like a lot of energy, but if you're able to successfully keep one of your Centiskorches kind of safe on the bench while you build up a lot of this energy and you take your first knockout, kind of like in the way that Lapras VMAX is, and they don't have a response, you're probably just going to roll them over and win. One of the big differences, however, is that Centiskorch isn't reliant on a stage 1 to get powered up, which is pretty nice. You're just reliant on your welders, and luckily fire just has so much support to get your decks up and running, it's really not even much of an issue. Now, that being said, there are still some other cards of kind of note that I want to point out there. I think one is actually Hyper Potion. Just because Hyper Potion is going to discard your energy, but you can just get it right back with Centiskorch VMAX. And also, I think that's actually something I really like about this card. The fact you're getting energy out of your discard pile already sort of naturally lowers the count of fire crystals you're going to be playing, which I think is a good thing because you're already a VMAX, which takes up more deck space than something like a basic Pokemon V. And needing to run less copies of something like Fire Crystal to keep your engine going, I think is really cool and might open up the space to play a card like Hyper Potion or maybe some other tanking cards. Because honestly, you kind of just want to go all in on one Centiskorch, I think. Two at the most in a game. If you could just keep piling energy on one while healing, that seems like kind of a cool strategy to me. So overall, I think Centiskorch VMAX is pretty solid. Much like with most other VMAXs, this guy can easily two-shot anything in the format, and of course has the massive one-shot potential as well. And it's a type that already has a lot of support, so I think that sets up Centiskorch VMAX to be a pretty solid card overall. Now, I mean, we do have Charizard coming out in the same set, so it kind of remains to be seen which of the Fire VMAXs people might lean a little bit more heavily into. I think it's more of a question of, once we get some hands-on time with these cards, which of these Fire VMAXs can more easily pull off that one-shot potential that they're both kind of going for. So that's one thing that remains to be seen. At the time of recording this portion of the set review, I have not been able to actually test with either of these cards just yet. So I don't have a firm stance on which I prefer, but I think on paper, I think you can successfully build around either Charizard or Centiskorch. And just like Charizard, I think Centiskorch is also a pretty solid card. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Milotic card. Milotic is a stage 1 with 120 HP, lightning weakness to retreat cost, and we're looking at really just for this ability here. It says once during your turn, you may heal 20 damage from each of your Pokemon. So simple enough. And one thing I do like about this card is that the fact that it does work from your bench. A lot of times you have like effects like this where your opponent has to be in the active to use this sort of effect, or it's an attack in and of itself. Just being a bench sitter that can heal 20 is kind of nice. This does stack as well, meaning if we have 4 Milotics somehow, which I highly doubt we are playing, we can be healing 80 per turn on top of any other additional healing cards beyond that, which is kind of fun to point out here. So right now in the pre-Darkness Ablaze format, one of the biggest cards that we have running around the format is actually Dracovish VMAX, which is very heavily based around doing spread damage. It also plays things like Galarian Zigzagoon as well to get in even more damage counters placed here and there. So something like Milotic could be a nice way at sort of combating against that sort of strategy, or if there is another sort of more general spread archetype that ever decides to pop up, maybe like Weezing as an example, or Flapple, Milotic could be a good sort of tech option to deal with those styles of decks that pop up. Otherwise, the 20 heal isn't going to be too relevant in a lot of situations. Every once in a while, the 20 heal might change a 2-shot to a 3-shot, but on average, I think this is really not going to be impactful in most decks. I think Milotic's more of a card that we're only going to be looking at if we are in a format that is very spread heavy. If spread ever does get popular, I would say play Milotic, but we do have to evolve from Phoebus. And Phoebus, all of the ones that we have are very low on HP. The one coming out in this same set has 30 HP, just as an example. And if you're going against a spread deck and they see you bench Phoebus, they're going to take that thing out. Think of something like Dragapult. Dragapult can very easily just wipe Phoebus off the board. Even if you bench 2, they could potentially knock out 2 all in the same attack. So I'm actually not entirely sold on this as a tech option for spread. And playing a stage 1 in your deck to heal 20, that feels a little bit awkward to me. I almost feel like I'd rather just play an extra copy of Mallow and Lana, maybe a copy or 2 of Hyper Potion. So while I do think Milotic has some good things going for it, I'm going to have to downvote this one overall. Next up, we're going to be looking at a new Vanillix. Vanillix is a stage 2 Pokemon, has 150 HP, Meta Weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. And we're really just looking at this for this ability that it has. It says once during your turn, if this Pokemon is your active, you may flip a coin. If heads, your opponent's active is now paralyzed. So I think paralysis is consistently one of the more interesting status conditions. It can very frequently be one of the most oppressive. And so anytime we can easily inflict paralysis, I think that's something we always kind of need to be taking a look at. Though I do have to say, I'm not entirely sold on Vanillix, however. Effectively, this card is no different than Mareep that we are losing in the rotation. So Mareep, if it's your active, will put your opponent's active asleep. Then, of course, in between turns, they have to flip to see if they wake up, which means effectively, this is just a stage 2 version of Mareep because you have to flip either way, whether it's Mareep or the Vanillix in this case. So I do think that is a little bit of a pain. We do have Air Balloon to reduce the retreat cost on Vanillix, making this a pretty effective like wall Pokemon for hit and run decks. But again, the issue, it's a stage 2. Mareep was just a basic we could throw down in any deck and easily be able to make use of its ability. Vanillix, much harder to get in play, and the effect is a coin flip, which is super problematic. And it doesn't have a great attack to fall back on either. So while I think inflicting paralysis is good, this is a lot of work to undergo for an effect like this. I really wish Vanillix was a stage 1. I think that would make me be more enticed to actually find the deck space for a coin flip ability like this. Or I wish this was maybe even a coming into a playability. That way we could reuse this with something like Scoop Up Net. That also would make Vanillix a little bit more enticing as well. But just based on how the card is structured, I can't say I'm a big fan of this, despite the effect of the ability being pretty good if you are able to flip heads. So I'm going to have to downvote Vanillix. Stage 2 version of Mareep just doesn't seem very good to me. Up next, guys, we are going to be looking at the first of the new fossil Pokemon that we are going to be getting in Darkness Ablaze, and this one is going to be Dracovish. So Dracovish, of course, is going to be a stage 1, and it does evolve from the rare fossil card, which is much like the current unidentified fossil, but with a little bit more HP. But the mechanic effectively works the same way. But it's a stage 1, and it has this ability: if this Pokemon is your active, your opponent can't play any Pokemon from their hand to evolve their Pokemon, and then its only attack for a water and 2 colorist is 120. So I think at a glance, a lot of people are going to be thinking, oh my god, this is Archeops. We have Archeops back in the format. But I would definitely caution your optimism. So even though Archeops was actually much harder to get in play, the ability on Archeops was substantially better than Dracovish. Dracovish has to be your active Pokemon to stop your opponents from evolving. So if this Pokemon is going to be in our active, that means we have to be playing this in either a hit and run style deck, or we have to be attacking with Dracovish. And honestly, guys, I'm not a big fan of either of those options, to be totally honest. Dracovish has a 3 retreat cost, which is super annoying. That means something like Air Balloon won't actually work with this card. So unless you're playing something like Beware and an Air Balloon, you're not going to be able to actually easily retreat this Dracovish out of play, making it not a very good hit and run style target. And the attack itself just isn't very good. 3 for 120 is pretty bad. Even though you can power this up with, of course, a Twin Energy and a Water Energy, 120 is just not a great number. And even other basic Pokemon can knock you out. Like even for VMAX decks that you might be trying to shut off, their base forms are in most cases more than capable enough to deal with this thing. So I just think Dracovish does a really bad job at what it's attempting to do. So guys, I know you can look at this ability and think back to Archeops and all of the oppressive sort of decks it has sort of enabled when it saw play with Maxis, but I would definitely caution against this. I don't think Dracovish is near as good, and actually I think this card is pretty bad. I don't really see a world where I am deciding to play this. If we get some better retreating methods, maybe we can revisit this, but for the moment, I don't think this is a viable attacker, and it's definitely not a viable wall either, making this ability very hard to actually make use of. So yeah, big thumbs down for me on Dracovish here. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at a new Pokemon V, and that is going to be Vikavolt V. So of course, Vikavolt here is a basic Pokemon, 210 HP, has 2 different attacks, first of which for a lightning and colorless. This is the big one that I think really has caught people's attention. Does 50 damage, and your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand during their next turn. And then its second attack for 2 lightning and a colorless is 190, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So Vikavolt, I mean, like I said, the attention for this card is definitely on the first attack. Kind of harkens back to Seismitoad EX. That's the big comparison a lot of people have been drawing here. And Vikavolt, this is actually one of those Pokemon who's coming out kind of at an unfortunate time. In Japan, this card came out many months ago and has been able to enjoy all of the luxuries of the pre-rotation format with things like Thunder Mountain and Electro Power. But with Vikavolt V coming out in our post-rotation format, it's a little bit harder to get quite as excited about this. But nevertheless, Item Lock is historically a fantastic effect. We've seen these types of cards have huge success, whether they be in the form of one-sided abilities like things like Trevenant, persistent abilities like things like Vileplume, attacks with things like Seismitoad EX, or even the old Manectric EX from many sets prior to that. So the precedent for item lock to be good is definitely there, and while my knee-jerk reaction was actually to downvote this card, I originally had it in my mind that I was going to give this card a bad rating, but the more I thought about it, the more I have come around to settling kind of in the middle on this. So the big thing that made Seismitoad EX actually viable despite having kind of a low damage output, much like with Vikavolt V here, is the fact that it had access to a large variety of different damage modifiers. So thinking back to things like Muscle Band, the Hypnotoxic Laser Verbank City Gym combo, even the Crobat evolution line, Seismitoad had a lot of ways to seriously compound its damage output, especially back in a format where maximum HPs were nowhere near the 300 threshold that we have since broken. So that's the big thing going against Vikavolt. Losing Electro Power I think is actually huge for this. Thunder Mountain, I think that's a bummer, but I think we can actually play around that. But losing Electro Power is really big, but luckily there still are a few ways to get around this. We do still have a Giant Bomb in the format. I think that's kind of where my initial thoughts are when attempting to build around Vikavolt. And unlike Seismitoad, Vikavolt actually has a kind of reliable secondary attack. You know, Seismitoad X largely just played double colorless energy and usually couldn't abuse that secondary heavier hitting attack that Seismitoad had. But since both of these are going to use lightning energy to get powered up, having the Super Zap Cannon attack is actually kind of nice to clean up some of your knockouts. So I think Vikavolt does have a few things going for it, even despite losing some important cards after the rotation. But if we are going to build around Vikavolt V, I think we do still have a good bit of cards that help this. There's plenty of disruption still in the format with things like Crushing Hammer and Team Yellgrunt. And we have the Scoop Up Net Engine sort of combo to use things like Giratina or Galarian Zigzagoon for both offensive and defensive options. So I think there's still a good bit to like about Vikavolt V. We just got Speed Lightning Energy as well last set, so that only is going to help the cause here. I really want to get some hands-on time with this card to see if the tools exist for this to still be a good card, because we can still get powered up with things like Cocoa Prism, things like the new Turbo Patch, etc. It just remains to be seen if we can compound our damage output enough to still keep up with other decks despite losing Electro Power. I think that's going to be the big thing that's really going to determine the success of this card in the short term. So overall, like I said, guys, I'm going to remain neutral, but this is a card that could easily become much better if we start to get some good generic sort of damage modifying cards. Up next, guys, we are getting ourselves a new Toxicity card. Toxicity is a stage 1 Pokemon, 120 HP. Has two different attacks here, the first of which is really the one we're going to hone in on for this discussion, though. So just for 2 colorless energy, or of course a single twin energy or triple acceleration energy, we flip a coin. If heads, discard 5 cards from the top of your opponent's deck. If tails, discard the top 5 cards from the top of your deck. This attack is pretty interesting. And while in most usual circumstances, this is a card I would quickly write off, but since we are getting the new Stadium card in the set that's going to allow us to reflip our coin flips if we don't like the results, I think there's more of a case to be made for Toxicity, especially since we're losing a Rangaroo in the rotation. There's definitely a void to be filled in terms of what is the best way to mill cards and win via a deck out sort of win condition. Now, I will say up front, guys, I am not the biggest mill player. I've probably literally played a mill or control deck at a major event like 2 or 3 times ever, and basically haven't touched any of the Oranguru base decks ever since they have sort of come out. So I might not be the biggest authority figure on this particular subject, but I think this card's like okay. I think the fact that if you flip tails, not only are you doing nothing to your opponent, but you're actually hurting yourself as well. I think that's one of the main things that's going to make me shift away from this thing, because inevitably you are going to flip tails, even with a card that allows you to reflip your coin flips. And yes, I know we can play things like Will as well, but realistically, if we're playing a supporter that is not a draw supporter, we want to be playing Bell but Bryson Man. So I think the fact that this is a coin flip might require you to run just a few too many cards to be able to build a consistent deck with this thing. I think if we're playing a stage 1 in the post-rotation format for mill, I think my knee-jerk reaction would probably be just play Excadrill in the same way that people play Ranger, since the cards are very, very similar. But I will say this, it's not going to stop me from messing around with this card. I think this is cool. You can play things like Curse Shovel as well if you want to try to mill an extra card here and there as well. I imagine you probably play this with like a Cincino engine, much like the other mill decks. That way you can still draw cards while also playing Belba Bryson Man. And if you are playing Belba Bryson Man, that's actually another reason why this attack is kind of bad if you do flip tails, because you're already going to be occasionally discarding cards from your own deck. And then if you flip tails, you're going to have to discard even more. Yeah, those are some of my big reservations for this card. I think I'm ultimately going to vote it down, but I think the attack is still cool, guys. I still will probably do a video on this card at some point just because it looks kind of fun to mess around with. But I definitely don't think this is the same power level of Oranguru in the context of Mildex going forward. So probably a pass on Toxicity for the moment. Next up, we're going to be getting into some more of the fossil Pokemon that are coming out in this set. So next up, we're going to be looking at Dracos Old. So Dracos Old here, of course, it is going to evolve from the new rare fossil card that is coming out in this set. It's a stage 1, 160 HP for retreat, fighting weakness. For retreat, of course, guys, we will keep that in mind in case we want to play something like Buff Padding or Pokemaniac, even potentially if you want to go down that route. But 160 HP on stage 1, already off to a good start. But the first attack here for lightning energy is 30. During your next turn, this Pokemon's rising charge attack does 90 more damage. And that secondary attack for 4 colorless energy is 200, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So I think there are some things to like about Dracos Old. Let's get this out of the way first. Buff Padding, like I said, can buff you up over 200 HP on a 1 prize stage 1. Gotta like that. I think that's, definitely worth throwing out there. First attack probably would have been decent pre-rotation because we would have had Electro Power and we could have, juiced up this 30 damage to really hit for some decent numbers for just a single energy. You have Speed Lightning Energy still in the format. Of course, we still have Cocoa Prism as well. Then the secondary attack isn't hard to get powered up either. You're always basically going to have a Lightning in play on this thing, and then every once in a while you can slap down a triple acceleration energy and get a bigger burst of damage. But like I said, guys, we are losing Electro Power, and that is going to be just such a big hindrance. 200 damage can't even knock out some of the basic Pokemon V running around in the format. So think of a Zacian, you don't really have a great way at taking out something like that. This is also, of course, still a fossil Pokemon, which means it's a little bit harder to get out than your normal Pokemon. And you can't really consistently stream the second attack, I don't think. I think the work that it would require to continuously hit for 200 with these Dracos Ults would just be better spent putting that energy into building a different deck that can hit 200 plus damage easier. So even just a normal Zacian deck, I feel like I've used this sort of example a couple times throughout the set review, but I mean, it really is true. Zacian just sets up so easily with Intrepid Sword and Metal Saucer. You can pretty consistently hit 230 from turn 2 onwards. So I just don't really see the incentive to play Dracos Old. So unfortunately, this is our second of the fossil Pokemon we've looked at, and this one is striking out as well. So I think I am going to have to pass on Dracos Old. Next up, we do have another lightning fossil Pokemon, and this is going to be Arxol. Arxol is a stage 1, of course, evolves from the rare fossil fighting weakness to retreat 130 HP. And it has this ability, and I think this is actually probably the most interesting aspect of any of these fossil Pokemon. But whenever your opponent attaches an energy from their hand to one of their Pokemon, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. So one thing I will point out, we've seen a bunch of different cards like this, throughout the course of the TCG. And a consistent thing we usually see is that these types of cards usually require the Pokemon that has these abilities to be in the active. And the fact that Arxol here can be on the bench and can stack, that's actually a little bit interesting because not only can they be anywhere in play, but since it's not limited to the active, like I said, you can have multiple of these on your bench to do more damage. So I think it's actually a kind of a cool ability, especially since we are in a format that, relatively speaking, doesn't really have many great ways at modifying damage output. I think Galarian Zigzagoon is probably our best option currently at the time of filming. But much like with all of these other fossil Pokemon, they are fossil Pokemon at the end of the day, which means you can't just quick ball for the basic and quickly get out your Arxol in the second turn. You're probably going to need some sort of engine that is conducive to these fossil Pokemon. Like you're going to need something like a Jirachi engine to maybe more easily find your fossils. Being part of the fossil mechanic might make the chances of a card like this seeing play a little bit tougher. But I think there's still something here, guys. Like I said, these abilities have been cool, but again, they've been very strict in terms of how they get activated. So the fact that this one is a little bit more flexible and we have so few good damage modification cards makes me think I'm going to remain a little bit neutral. I think this is actually the best of the fossil cards we looked at. Not that that's an achievement in and of itself or anything, since they really haven't been very good in this set. But I think this one has a sliver of hope. So up next, we have Mew finally getting its Pokemon V debut in the Sword and Shield era of the game. So Mew, it's always interesting to see what they do with Mew. It's historically gotten pretty great cards, whether they've been EXs, normal Pokemon, whatever they might be. Mew's always been sort of cool in the TCG. But Mew V here only has a single attack here for 2 Psychic Energy, does 30 damage times the amount of energy attached to this Pokemon and your opponent's active Pokemon. So this is the same attack that we currently have on Victini V, or of course even going back to Gardevoir GX back from Burning Shadows, or even you can think of it as more of a juiced up version of the famous X-Ball attack on Mewtwo EX back from Next Destinies as well. So we've definitely seen a lot of Pokemon with these styles of attacks do well in the past, so you would think Mew would also be pretty good, but I'm actually not so sold on this. Before we get into that, I will point out this does have a free retreat cost, which is something you always kind of like to see here. But Mew is definitely releasing into an interesting time for Psychic Pokemon. We are losing Malamar, which of course would be one of the big ways you would get something like this powered up. And while we do have things like Turbo Patch or even other weird things like there's a random Rotom that's still around post-rotation. There's a Butterfree that you can potentially use on turn 1 to accelerate some energy, etc. There's not too many really good ways at powering up a Mew V. And with this being the only attack on the card, I think it's really hard to get excited about this. So it's kind of unfortunate to see Mew's Sword and Shield era debut be kind of underwhelming, but the card just unfortunately doesn't really have, you know, much to stand on. Even Victini V, like, while its second attack is pretty good, I feel like in my experience I'm using the first attack, you know, just as much, if not more sometimes, than the second attack. And like I said, Mew just doesn't have anything like that to fall back on. So if it doesn't have any other attacks to use, and its only attack that it currently has doesn't have a great way at getting powered up, you know, Mew probably just will not see some play. So unfortunately, going to be a hard pass on this one. But, you know, if we get some good Psychic Energy acceleration, maybe down the road we can come back and revisit Mew V here. So next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Mimikyu. Mimikyu is a basic Pokemon, 70 HP. Dark weakness, 1 retreat. Of course, the weakness not too relevant since we only have 70 HP. But Mimikyu has an interesting ability here. Your opponent's benched Pokemon can't be healed. And as I understand it right now, I do believe this actually will stop Mallow and Lana. That was one of the things I was kind of wondering about when I first saw this card get revealed. But as I understand it, you heal with Mallow and Lana after you switch to the bench, meaning Mimikyu would actually prevent that. So that's actually really relevant for this discussion in case any of you guys were wondering about how that interaction works. And with Mallow and Lana being a card that sees a fair bit of play, and as we get more and more VMAXs, which naturally would want to abuse Mallow and Lana since they have such high HP, Mimikyu actually could start to become a better and better tech. And while we don't have a whole lot of other very popular healing cards right now, you know, if any do decide to pop up, like let's say the new Milotic that we looked at the beginning of the set review, just as an example, Mimikyu is an easy sort of counter tech to that sort of Pokemon. So I could see this if you are playing maybe like a spread deck, just as an example. Mimikyu seems like it could be a decent tech if the primary way of healing is damage removal and not like scoop up style cards. Mimikyu could be very good in those sorts of situations. The big downside, of course, this card though is the fact that it is just limited to bench Pokemon. So in DDV, just as an easy example, Mimikyu is not going to get around that, making its application pretty limited. So while I don't think there's any one specific archetype that I think Mimikyu is coming out that is just immediately going to completely shut down and is going to ruin this sort of hypothetical top tier archetype, even though I don't think there's a situation like that right now that exists, I think being able to show off Mallow and Lana is honestly kind of good enough in a lot of instances, especially if you're a deck that also plays Mallow and Lana and you want an edge in the mirror. Mimikyu could be a good tech to give yourself an edge in the mirror. That way you can use your Mallow and Lanas, but your opponent can't. So that's a sort of scenario I can envision for this as well. So yeah, guys, I still like the card enough to stand by. I think this is a good potential tech card. We just have to keep our eyes peeled on the healing that we're going to have in the format. So next up, guys, we're going to be looking at, I think, what is one of the most interesting sort of collections of Pokemon we're getting in Darkness Ablaze, and that's going to be the Mad Party sort of suite of attackers and like support Pokemon. So much like with what we've seen with previous styles of decks like Lost March, Night March, etc., all of these Pokemon have the Mad Party attack, and that's really what this whole thing is going to be based around here. For this discussion, we really just want to sort of hone in on the Poltegeist and the Bunnelby. I think those are going to be the main Pokemon. The other ones that we have on screen, those are just going to be Pokemon we are attempting to throw away into the discard pile, just because their attacks are a little too clunky to get up and running. With Poltegeist and Bunnelby, we can just use single energy attachments to get up and running and attacking. So before we start talking about the archetype as a whole and kind of my thoughts on it, I do want to briefly go over the ability on Poltegeist, since it is actually pretty relevant here. It says once during your turn, you may discard a Pokemon with a Mad Party attack from your hand and draw 2 cards. So I think this is actually a pretty cool effect that we do have. It's kind of like a slightly nerfed version of Trade or Make Do on Cincino. So even though it's not quite as strong, because again, it has to be just a Pokemon with Mad Party, I do think this is still good. It's a nice consistency booster, both in terms of drawing cards and getting your attacker set up, and also getting the Pokemon you need into the discard pile. So I think it's actually a really great ability that we have here. Now, what do I think about the deck as a whole? So let's run through the damage on this. I don't think you're going to attempt to one-shot VMAXs. You just need, I think, far too many Pokemon in the discard pile to really consistently be able to pull something like this off. I think most time we're just going for 2 shots, and we really just want to be hitting for, I think, really like 220 damage plus, just because that's sort of the magic number you need to knock out like 2 prize Pokemon V running around. So we need 11 Pokemon with Mad Party in the discard pile. Basically, we need all 4 Dedenne, all 4 Galarian Mr. Rime, and some combination of Poltegeist or Bunnelby in the discard pile. And while that does seem like a good bit, especially in a format without something like Battle Compressor, I don't think it's the end of the world. We do have a good bit of discarding effects right now to kind of expedite that process. Of course, Poltegeist has its ability, but we also do still have things like the Dedenne GX. We have Professor's Research, Quick Ball, and we even have other things like Roxy, just as an example, or maybe even Hapu. I think that's another potential option for getting things in the discard pile. There's also Spirit Tomb if you really want to go down that route, but you'd have to play some copies of Dark Energy, and that's probably just kind of bad, to be honest. So even without that, though, I think we still have a good bit of ways of getting stuff in the discard pile. The other thing I do want to point out is that everything in this archetype is pitifully weak. Like, God forbid you go against any sort of spread deck out there. So I think the big one that comes to mind is going to be Dragapult VMAX. Dragapult VMAX has been very popular during the Rebel Clash format, but luckily for the Mad Party deck, we have some really strong dark Pokemon coming out in this set. And if they can successfully scare off Dragapult VMAX, then the path is clear for Poltegeist to kind of be okay in that regard and not just get instantly railed by Dragapult. But even with Dragapult in the format, I do want to point out we are getting a new Pokemon tool card in this set that, while attached to your active Pokemon, prevents effects of attacks done to all of your Pokemon. So that could be a potential tech option. If Dragapult does still remain to be a popular deck, that can be one way you can attempt to play around that. But generally speaking, I think we're just kind of crossing our fingers here, hoping that dark Pokemon are going to sort of keep Dragapult at bay. So do I think the Mad Party archetype as a whole is good? Yeah, sure, of course. We have Twin Energy to power up Bunnelby, Triple Acceleration to power up Poltegeist. The Poltegeist is a nice consistency booster. We have a bunch of ways to discard stuff. So, I mean, I see all the pieces here. Do I think it's going to be tier 1? No, I'm not really convinced of that. In terms of all of the similar style of decks we've seen in the past, like Night March, Lost March, and like the Mad Party deck, I think it's probably the worst of the 3. Just because this is hitting for the same sort of damage multiplier in a format with Pokemon with much higher HP. When Lost March came out, the popular Pokemon at the time were between 210 and 230 HP at the max. And now that's sort of like the mid-range in terms of HP we're seeing on Pokemon. So I think the damage output for these decks hasn't really sort of kept up with the time. So I think that's the big thing that's going to make me ultimately land a little bit more neutral on the Mad Party deck. Can you win a league challenge with Mad Party? I think so. Can you do well at a League Cup? Also probably true. Do I think you're going to win a regional? Nah. But don't get confused, guys. We are definitely going to cover the Mad Party deck on the channel. Definitely want to get in some games with this, see how it's going to fare. It is a one prize deck at the end of the day that has sort of this in theory, unlimited damage cap. You can power it up easily with a single attachment. It's going to be consistent and hit pretty hard. So we'll have to see where it's going to land. I'd say definitely pick up a playset of all these cards. They're probably not going to be too expensive. They're good enough to at least have on hand. So I know that's sort of my long-winded way of saying I don't really know how good this archetype is going to be. It will be decent, just not tier 1. Next up, guys, we are going to be looking at a new Flygon card. Flygon, of course, is a stage 2 Pokemon, has 150 HP, has this ability: if this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, your opponent's active can't retreat. And then its only attack for a fighting and 2 colorist is 130, and if your opponent has a Stadium in play, discard it. If you do, during your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage and effects done to this Pokemon by the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon. So let's just run through some things really quick about this. I mean, the ability is pretty good. We've seen this sort of effect a lot in the past. I think one of the more famous Pokemon that had this ability was the Team Plasma Snorlax. Now granted, that was a basic Pokemon and it saw play basically partially just because of that ability. I don't think we are playing Flygon solely for that ability, since it is a stage 2. We need to actually be committed, I think, to attacking with this thing if we're going through the trouble of getting it set up. And I think while this attack cost is 3 energy, I really don't think this is that big of a deal, because we do still have Karate Belt in the format, which means if we're behind on prizes, which, let's face it, if we're playing a stage 2, we're probably going behind on prizes early on. That means we can, with just a Karate Belt, we can attack for just a single twin energy or triple acceleration energy if we want to go that route instead, which means I think we can actually get our Flygons powered up somewhat reliably here. And the effect of this attack is actually really good. And actually, if you don't read it close enough, it seems kind of broken. I remember when I first read this card, when the Japanese translations came out a couple months ago, I was like, oh my god, we get to discard a Stadium, then prevent all damage on the next turn? That's insane. But then if you read closely, you realize, oh wait, if your opponent has a Stadium in play, which is definitely much different. So if your opponent is smart and they see you're playing Flygon, they're just not going to put a Stadium card in play, which is really the Achilles heel of Flygon, unfortunately. So while it is nice you can get rid of those chaotic swells from play and other annoying Stadiums like that, your opponent's probably just not going to put them down, to be honest, guys. Like, they might put down 1 Stadium early game, but, you might only get like 1 effect off of this if you're playing against a decent player. So that's where Flygon loses me. I think this card was like pretty close to being good. 130 is also just shy of being where it needs to be. I mean, granted, we have Martial Arts Dojo, guys, so we can increase our damage output a little bit, but I think part of what makes Flygon decent is the fact that it can abuse Karate Belt to get around needing fighting energies every turn. And we need fighting energies to be able to use Martial Arts Dojo. So I think those cards don't exactly synergize too well here. So I have to say, Flygon's like a card that's like just a couple of design tweaks away from being a pretty solid 1 prize stage 2 Pokemon. All of the things that Flygon does are good. They're just sort of contingent on your opponent. And your opponent can easily, I think, just play around this. So unfortunately, Flygon is going to get the thumbs down. So next up, guys, we're going to be looking at another Pokemon V. That is going to be Rhyperior V. It's a basic Pokemon, 230 HP, 4 retreat cost, grass weakness. So of course, we do want to keep in mind that 4 retreat cost, because we can use buff padding if we want to, or the new toughness cape if we prefer to use that, but they're effectively going to be pretty similar here. But this one has 2 different attacks, first of which for a fighting and 2 colorist does 80, and you discard 1 energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. And its second attack for a fighting and 3 colors is 210, and this Pokemon can't use this attack during your next turn. So yeah, Rhyperior, this is kind of an awkward Pokemon. So initially when I was kind of brainstorming for this card, I was thinking, well, okay, you just play this with Colossal. You have colorless energy, so that gives you some flexibility in using the fire energy with Colossal to get this thing powered up. You just play that, but if you're doing that, why not just play Sandaconda? Sandaconda is just a better attacker, has a nice first attack that you can use to kind of help get set up, get some chip damage in as well. So I really just think this card's pretty bad in the context of the Colossal deck, which already not that good. But there is a world where you could maybe play this in a welder based deck, just because your primary attack cost is actually colorless. Fighting is actually the energy that's a little bit more flexible in the attack cost here. So I think if you're going to attempt to build around Rhyperior, you'd probably go sort of like the route players were going with my Milotic V in the early Rebel Clash format. And that seems like generally, I think, a better way to get powered up, and also creates, I think, naturally a bit more space in your deck to be able to sort of capitalize on the good aspects of Rhyperior. So of course, the big thing with its first attack is you can discard an energy, which is nice. So if you want to double down on that sort of strategy, you can play additional things like Crushing Hammer, or maybe Clefable, or Giratina with like the Scoop Up Net Engine combo. I think there are ways you can sort of play with this, but I definitely think there are some additional downsides to this. So the big thing is, while a lot of people I think might initially look to something like Martial Arts Dojo to do more damage, if you're playing the Welder engine, you're gonna need Giant Hearth, and that's sort of the issue for that sort of style of deck. If you're playing the Colossal engine, I think you could probably play Dojo and do more damage that way. But overall, guys, I have to say I'm just really not too impressed with Rhyperior V. Like, the damage output is already kind of mediocre, like 80 for 3. Not really where we want to be in this day and age. Like, you're going to have to 3-shot even like some of the basic Pokemon V that are out there. But I will say, the good thing is you are fighting type. Fighting does look to be a good type going into the early days of the post-rotation format, since Dark has a lot of hype that's riding on right now. So while there's things to like, I think this card is just kind of awkward. I don't think it does any particular one thing really well. And overall, I just think there might be better options out there. Like for Welder decks, Rhyperior is not my go-to option. Like, I'm probably playing Hound Doom V that we looked at in this set review over Rhyperior if I'm playing a basic Pokemon V that's a Welder target from this set. So right here, I'm going to vote it down, guys. I mean, you can build around this. You can probably build a functioning deck with it in there. But I just don't think it's going to have what it takes to go toe-to-toe with some of the stuff that's going to be in the format. So going to be a thumbs down for me. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at another Pokemon V. This time it's going to be Galarian Slowbro V. This is, of course, a dark Pokemon with 210 HP, fighting weakness, and 3 retreat cost. And it has this ability: once during your turn, if this Pokemon is your active, you may leave your opponent's active poisoned. And its only attack here for 2 dark and a colorless is 130, and during your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon can't retreat. So just want to get this out of the way. I don't think if we are going to play Galarian Slowbro, it's going to be for any attacking purposes. 3 for 130 on a multi-prize Pokemon just really isn't too great. Again, I'm going to wear out this comparison, but if we're attaching 3 energies to a basic Pokemon V, it's going to be Zacian, more than likely. So, you could do 230 with something like that, or you can do 130 with something like this. Take your pick. So, yeah, I don't think we're going to be attacking with Slipper. I think if we're playing this, it's actually going to be just for this ability in particular. Just to fix math with the chip damage that comes from being poisoned, or maybe to activate some sort of bonus damage effect of an attack from our opponent having a status condition. So one of the main ones that comes to mind actually for the expanded format, it's actually in the case of Darkrai GX, of course, for the Dead End GX attack. If your opponent's active is affected by a special condition, then the Pokemon is automatically knocked out. So in the Turbo Dark deck in the expanded format, sometimes cards like Hypnotoxic Laser have been played. Other times we've seen things like Malamar EX to inflict this status condition. And now Galarian Slowbro V is another one to sort of add to the mix. So let's say your opponent knocks something out. You can promote Galarian Slowbro between turns, poison your opponent's active, then retreat into your Darkrai, take that automatic KO. So I think this actually is pretty nice, but the issue is historically in Turbo Dark, the deck hasn't run too many normal switching cards outside of maybe like Guzma. So if your opponent hasn't taken a knockout and you want to do this sort of combo I'm talking about, it's going to be kind of awkward to do so unless you have a Guzma in your hand ready to go as well. So I think Galarian Slowbro, it makes some sense in expanded, but I'm actually still not sure if I'm playing this over Malamar EX or just a couple copies of Hypnotoxic Laser. Those might just be a little bit easier to more consistently pull off. Now, getting back to standard format, since that is sort of the bulk of our discussion in these set reviews, I think maybe just playing Galarian Zigzagoon is generally going to be a little bit better. It doesn't require you to be in the active spot, and you can reuse it with Scoop Up Net as well. The other issue with Galarian Slowbro is, of course, that it does have a 3 retreat cost. So like I said, you would need a hide energy attached to it, which means it's not attached to one of your attackers, which is definitely not good. And you can't play Air Balloon because, again, you have a 3 retreat cost. So you are forced to commit some sort of energy or play some sort of normal switching card if you do want to get your Slowbro out of the active spot after you activate this ability. So guys, while I think this ability is kind of cool, as you can see, it's just like a little bit shy of being a decent card. Like if Slowbro had a 2 retreat cost, I might change my tune a little bit. But overall, right now, whether it's expanded or standard format, I really don't see a great home for Galarian Slowbro V at the moment. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at Ariados. Ariados is a new Stage 1 Pokemon, Dark type, has 110 HP, fighting weakness, to retreat, And the thing really worth kind of talking about here is going to be this ability. It says whenever you play this card from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you may switch one of your opponent's evolution Pokemon with their active. So anytime we get new gusting effects in the format, especially when they are in the form of a trainer card or an ability, I think we pretty much always need to take these seriously and see if they have some potential. So the good thing about this is the fact that this is an ability, not an attack. You also don't have to be in the active spot to activate this ability. And you can even abuse things like Scoop Up Net to reuse this Eternatus, throughout the course of a game. We are also getting Eternatus VMAX, of course, in this same set. And Eternatus is reliant on having dark Pokemon on the bench to do more damage. So Eternatus, on paper, looks like it would be a theoretically decent bench sitter for that sort of deck. So those are sort of the things that we have going for Eternatus here. But there are definitely some downsides. One of the big ones that we just got Boss's Orders in the last set, which is, generally the best sort of gusting effect that we have right now. Eternatus is also a stage 1, which makes it a little bit of a target whenever you bench that Spinarak from your hand. Your opponent could theoretically just target that down and take it out. You have to wait at least a turn before you're going to be able to use this ability, and also the ability itself is just kind of limiting. Think back to Lycanroc GX that we had back from the Sun and Moon era. Lycanroc had basically the same ability, but there was no limitations on the Pokemon that you could bring up, and Lycanroc was also a pretty decent attacker of its own. So Eternatus, even though it only gives up one prize, unlike Lycanroc, doesn't have a good attack, and the ability is limited to only evolution Pokemon. So currently, for the past several months in the game, evolution Pokemon just generally haven't been very good. We've had a couple decks that play some evolution bench sitters from time to time, like Malamar just as an example, but generally speaking, there's not too many evolution Pokemon that see play. Now, I will say this, Darkness Ablaze is giving us a pretty good collection of new Pokemon VMAX, so the more that VMAXs see play, the more Eternatus could see play as well. But, I just kind of wonder if this is really what we are going to be filling our Eternatus VMAX deck with. I think if Boss's Orders didn't just come out, we'd have to look at this card a little bit more seriously. So for that reason, I am going to downvote Eternatus. Not that this ability is horrible, it's just we have way better gusting options right now in the current format. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon V to look at, and that is going to be Crobat V. So Crobat V, of course, is going to be one of the main cards that people are really going to be on the hunt for from Darkness Ablaze. And let's take a look at why here. So it is a basic 180 HP, Fighting Weakness 1 Retreat. The HP is definitely a little bit on the lower side, but the reason this card has so much attention is for this ability. Once during your turn, whenever you play this card from hand to your bench, you may draw until you have 6 cards in your hand, but you can't use more than one of these abilities during your turn. And Crobat also does have an attack here for Dark Colorist to 70 and your opponent's active is poisoned. Not the worst thing in the world, but of course we're not really playing a Crobat V like attacking deck. We're playing this just for this ability. And this is sort of like a functional reprint of Shaymin EX's setup ability. Of course, it is restricted to just once per turn. That's the big difference between a card like this and Shaymin. But nevertheless, don't get it confused. Crobat V is still an excellent card. And that's really not too hard to see. The Dene GX sees play in so many different decks, despite it having sort of the same sort of limitation that Crobat has in terms of only being able to use one of those abilities per turn. But one thing that's actually really cool is the fact that you can use the Dene GX, and then you can still play Crobat V in the same turn, making your deck a little bit more aggressive in terms of its draw power than it would previously be able to have. So if you were a deck that previously played multiple copies of the Dene, I think you're probably changing at least one over to a Crobat V just to enable you the option to be able to dig harder again on your same turn with Crobat here as well. And there's just really not too much to say about why this is so good. A lot of times you'll play a draw supporter, maybe you whiff the energy or the Pokemon you needed. Of course, you can play a quick ball, find yourself a Crobat, and keep on digging and draw some more cards. So one thing I do like about Crobat specifically too is that Crobat's actually a little bit better in certain decks than Dedenne. Not only does it have more HP and isn't a great catcher target, but also too, just some decks are very combo oriented. They might have a lot of moving pieces, and something like the Dedenne GX might just be sort of a necessary evil, and they just might be the type of deck that doesn't want to frequently discard all of the resources in their hand. So yeah guys, there's just not enough good things to say about Crobat V here. Because of how good this ability is, we could even see some decks attempt to play sort of like a Pierce engine just to be able to abuse something like Crobat V if they do decide to. The point is, Crobat's just going to see a tremendous amount of play. I don't really see any reason why it won't. And this is definitely going to be one of the absolute must-have cards that you really need to pick up if you are picking up cards from Darkness Ablaze. Next up, we're going to be looking at a new Darkrai. Darkrai is a 1 prize basic Pokemon, 120 HP, grass weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. And it has this ability: if this Pokemon has a dark energy attached, it takes 20 less damage from attacks. So effectively giving you 140 max HP if you are undamaged. And then its only attack here for 3 colorless energy to 60 plus 20 more for each dark energy attached to this Pokemon. So this is kind of cool. We have a 1 prizer here that has an unlimited damage cap. So if we just are paying for the base attack cost, we're hitting for 120, which is okay. You know, with 4 energy, you're hitting for 140 and so on and so forth. So this could potentially be just a nice little 1 prizer to help 2-shot things with. That isn't going to be quite as big of a liability as some of the other dark attackers that we have in the format. And so of course we can power this thing up with Weavile GX if we need to, but also we have the new Hydreigon, which we're going to be talking about shortly as well, to accelerate as many dark energies from hand as we like. So even though we're not building around Darkrai, I mean, I think we have to consider this card just as a potential single prize attacker in these styles of decks. So I think the big card this has to really compete with though is going to be Guzzlord. They're both pretty similar cards. They're going to attack for roughly the same amount of damage, though Darkrai, of course, has the upside that it can scale even higher than Guzzlord if needed. But the big thing with Guzzlord is the fact that if you take a knockout with it, you get an extra prize, which is pretty nice, I do have to say. So that's really the trade-off you have to look at if you are trying to decide on one of these types of Pokemon to fill that single prize role in your deck. I think you can maybe even make the argument that Darkrai might be better in Hydreigons and Guzzlord might be better in Weavile, just because Weavile isn't going to be able to scale this damage quite as high, quite as easily, since it lacks a significant amount of energy acceleration. So I think that would be sort of my knee-jerk reaction of how to play this Darkrai, but it's an okay card, guys. I don't want to say it's bad. Like, I don't think this is going to see widespread play, but I think it's an okay card. So I'm going to remain neutral in the middle. If your dark decks are looking for that sort of single prize attacker, especially to get around something like the new Decidueye, if that does prove to be a popular sort of deck, Darkrai, I think, just has to be a consideration. So for that reason, I'm going to remain neutral on it. I think the card has some degree of potential. So next up, like we previously mentioned, there is going to be a new Hydreigon in Darkness Ablaze, and Hydreigon is a Stage 2 Pokemon, 160 HP, Grass Weakness, and a 3 Retreat cost. And the attack, while not great, is definitely overshadowed by this ability here. It says, as often as you like during your turn, you may attach a Dark Energy from hand to one of your Pokemon. So this is, effectively like a Rain Dance style effect, but for Dark Pokemon, which is really cool. And every time we get one of these printed, I always sort of throw out there, the precedent is set for a card like this to be successful. We've seen things in the past like Emboar, Blastoise, a variety of different Magnezones, etc. All see a good bit of play. And the big difference between something like this and Frostmoth is, of course, while Frostmoth is a Stage 1, you can accelerate your energy to any Pokemon. They don't have to be water Pokemon, and they can be your active Pokemon, which is something that is also kind of nice. I think that is one of the awkward things about Frostmoth. Not so much the limitation to only water Pokemon, but the fact that it has to be on your bench. It forces you to run, all sorts of switching cards to make sure that you can consistently sort of attach where you want to. So while Hydreigon is going to be a little clunkier to get up and running, there are definitely some things I like much better about it. And Dark lately in general has kind of been struggling for a solid source of energy acceleration. Up until now, probably the most effective way to accelerate dark energies has been with the Weavile GX red and blue sort of engine. So Hydreigon's definitely a much more aggressive form of energy acceleration. Even though it's a Stage 2, it doesn't require this weird convoluted combo to get energies into play. It's just straightforward. It's like, hey, can you get your Stage 2 set up? Okay, cool. Throw down your energies whenever you want. It's pretty self-explanatory. So I actually think I do kind of like this. I don't think this is really going to see play with something like Eternatus, just because Eternatus has a pretty manageable attack cost on its own. You can probably get by with just some copies of Turbo Patch and kind of call it a day. But of course, Hydreigon does pair pretty nicely with the new Grimmsnarl VMAX. We'll be getting to that card shortly as well. But if we do keep getting any more strong dark Pokemon with massive attack costs, Hydreigon's definitely going to be the go-to partner. And also for a lot of the existing tag team dark Pokemon like Umbreon Darkrai or Mega Sableye Tyranitar, I think Hydreigon's going to be generally a much more attractive partner than the Weavile engine, just because those Pokemon have these big attack costs and they really want a lot of energy on them. So Hydreigon's probably going to be the best way to play those going forward, I would assume. So while it's not going to be the go-to energy acceleration option for every dark deck, I do think there are some that are in the format that would like a card like this. But in terms of landing on a rating for this card, it's really hard to say, because I think while in a vacuum, I think Hydreigon is pretty solid since these cards have historically been good. I'm not sold on Grimmsnarl VMAX, and tag teams are gradually sort of getting, power crept out of the format more and more. So you guys can kind of tell I'm kind of torn between a more neutral rating and a positive rating, but I think I'm still going to stand beside Hydreigon. These abilities historically have been good, and we're only going to get more and more dark Pokemon. So for that reason, I'm going to say I like Hydreigon, kind of with an asterisk saying I'm not convinced that this will see a ton of play in the short term, since I don't believe Grimmsnarl VMAX to be the best VMAX that we're going to have. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Hoopa. Hoopa is a basic Pokemon with 120 HP, Grass Weakness, 2 Retreat Cost, and it has this one singular attack here for a Dark Energy, does 90 damage, and if this Pokemon wasn't moved from your bench to the active spot during your turn, this attack does nothing, and this attack isn't affected by weakness. So Hoopa is a really, really straightforward card. Kind of functions much like Zapdos, much like with the Glycopod of the past. And even though you can't hit for weakness, I really don't mind this. I could easily see something like Hoopa sliding into some sort of like Zap Beasts style of deck in the future, where you're basically just trying to take a bunch of cheap prizes on low HP basics. It's nice because you can knock out things like Jirachi, maybe even soften up something bigger than that for your Pokemon Vs or GXs to come in and finish off a 2-hit knockout with. And just in general, like I said, guys, I like the card. While I'm building up my bench, it's nice to be able to just go in with a Hoopa really quickly on turn 1, get some chip damage in, or get a cheap prize or two before your opponent gets set up. And the card's solid. It doesn't have something like Electro Power like Zapdos had to scale this damage up to be really crazy or anything like that. But Dark's getting a ton of support. I think you could easily slide 1 or 2 of these into the Eternatus deck and use Hoopa to put on your early game pressure while you're building up your Eternatus and your bench to come in the mid to late game and start really doing a ton of damage that way. So like I said, guys, straightforward card, but I like it. I think you could fit it into decks with Aurora Energy if you want to, or even, like I said, the designated dark decks that are going to be popping up as well. I'm a fan of Hoopa, so thumbs up for me. Up next, guys, we're going to start getting into some of the heavier hitting dark Pokemon that we're getting in Darkness Ablaze. The first one's going to be Grimmsnarl VMAX. And of course, we do need to quickly look over the base form Grimmsnarl as well. It's a basic Pokemon, 220 HP, Grass Weakness, 2 Retreat Cost, and its first attack for Dark Energy just does 40 damage, and its second attack for 3 Dark Energy is 200, and you return 2 Dark Energy from this Pokemon to your hand. Nothing groundbreaking, but 200 is at least kind of a nice number to hit for. You can knock out things like Dedenne, Crobat, etc. And of course, you can see they're sort of pushing the Hydreigon sort of package with this thing. So getting the energies back in your hand really isn't awful either if you do want to. But looking on to Grimmsnarl VMAX, definitely the more exciting out of the 2 cards. It's a VMAX with 330 HP, Grass Weakness, and a 3 Retreat Cost. And it just has 1 attack here, so for 3 Dark Energy, it does 170, plus 50 more for each extra Dark Energy attached to this Pokemon, but not used to pay for this attack. Energy beyond the second doesn't count. So I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but let's break down really what that means. So the first 3 energies that you have on this is just going to do the base 170 damage, but then your 4th energy you attach is going to boost you up to 220, and then your next energy from there is going to boost you up to 270, and any additional energies beyond that 5th energy don't count for anything. So you're effectively capped out at 270, which is actually a pretty good number to hit for, since that's going to knock out the majority of the tag teams. It is a little bit unfortunate you are 10 damage short of knocking out something like ADP, but of course that's fairly easily solvable with something like a Vitality Band or a Galarian Zigzagoon. So one of the things I will say I do like about Grimmsnarl in particular, though, is the fact that unlike some of these 2-shot oriented Pokemon VMAX we've been looking at in this set review, you actually have the capability of knocking out base form Pokemon V and two prize Pokemon GX, which is something really nice because some of them are a little short of knocking out something like a Zacian, which is definitely a little bit of a bummer. So I really do like you have the capability of being able to do that. That I think is really the big selling point of Grimmsnarl and really the case to be made for it. However, I think my big gripe with this whole sort of deck idea is space, to be honest. You're going to be running a lot of Pokemon just to get set up because you have your stage 2 line, you effectively have a stage 1 line on top of that, and you're going to need to run a good bit of energy to be able to consistently have energy in hand to accelerate with something like Hydreigon. Because let's be real, guys, you're not going to be playing the Rose engine or the Weavile GX engine, I think, just because you need more energy than average. If this was just sort of a 3 energy attacker on average, I would say those other engines are fine. But because we are eyeing down attaching more than that, I think Hydreigon probably is the best way to power this thing up. And also, when we compare this to some of the other VMAXs we've been talking about in this same set review, most of them have much more consistent engines. So think of something like Centiskorch VMAX or even Charizard VMAX. Both those guys have the Welder engine, which takes up significantly less space. But I have to say, I'm just not very convinced of Grimmsnarl VMAX. So believe it or not, I'm actually going to downvote this card altogether. It's really not that it's bad, but again, guys, if you're trying to hit for this same amount of damage, I think there's just better cards that do that. So unfortunately for Grimmsnarl here, I am going to downvote this one. Alrighty guys, here we go. Up next we have Eternatus VMAX, definitely one of the big cards that I know you've probably been waiting to see get discussed here in this set review. Let's take a look and see why people are excited about Eternatus VMAX. It's of course a VMAX line, so let's look at the base form Eternatus V. It is a basic 220 HP, fighting weakness, to retreat, and its first attack just does 30 damage for a colorless energy, and you may attach 1 dark energy from hand to one of your benched Pokemon. And then its second attack for a dark and 3 colorless does 120, and if your opponent's active is a VMAX, this attack does 120 more damage. So let's just get this out of the way. I don't think we're ever really going to use this second attack. I don't see a great way to get this powered up unless we were running something like a Hydreigon engine or maybe like a Weavile red and blue engine or something like that. But I really don't think we're doing anything like that in this sort of Eternatus deck. But I will say the first attack is actually decent. It's very similar to the Oblivion Wing attack we saw in Yveltal all the way back from the X and Y era. So I like this. You can set up a second Eternatus if your one in the active spot gets knocked out on your opponent's next turn. And this is nice because Eternatus is a relatively low maintenance VMAX. You only need 2 energies total. So getting this extra energy in play is actually really nice. I do like this. But then looking ahead to Eternatus VMAX, 340 HP. So it is among the tankiest of all the VMAXs that we have. Similar stats, fighting weakness, to retreat, but it has this ability: if all of your Pokemon in play are dark, you may now have up to 8 dark Pokemon on your bench and can't play any other type of Pokemon. And when this ability no longer works, discard your bench Pokemon until there are 5 left. And then its attack here for dark colorless does 30 times the amount of dark Pokemon you have in play. So this is pretty cool. We basically have the return of the Mega Ray archetype. This is basically Mega Ray Quasi EX with a Sky Field built into it. We're getting Crobat, which is effectively just Shaman EX in the same set as well. So kind of cool to see this old archetype get repurposed for a modern era. And I have to say, I'm kind of excited to mess around with this. Mega Ray is actually one of my favorite decks of all time, so I'm definitely excited to give Eternatus a whirl here. But yeah, let's talk about some of the specifics of this. Of course, the ability is really good. We have plenty of good bench-sitting dark Pokemon that we are going to want in play as well. So of course, Crobat V is going to be the absolute biggest one, just because not only does it fuel our attack, but we get to draw cards every turn with it as well. So we can safely max out our copies of that. We also have Galarian Zigzagoon, which I think is really important too, because if we look at the math on Eternatus, let's just run through it. If our entire field is dark Pokemon, we're going to be hitting 270, which is good. We can knock out a lot of the VMAXs, but Zigzagoon is going to allow us to knock out things like ADP, and also if we're playing a scoop up net engine or something like that, we can actually get down a lot of extra snipe damage with it and scale up to picking off opposing VMAXs as well eventually, which is something I really do like about this. So I think if we're playing this, I'm kind of thinking we're going all in and trying to take one-shots with Eternatus with our Zigzagoon. So I'm kind of envisioning a heavy sort of scoop up net engine with this Granted, we do have the new Eternatus as well, which we briefly talked about, but that's not really probably one of my favorite options for this. But we can even play other things too, like you could probably play a thin Weavile GX line if you did decide to, though I'm not convinced that's necessary, just because it's a decent bench sitter and it can move your energy around, which is pretty nice. I think the other question to sort of answer that some people might be thinking is, well, this has a 2 attack cost, so how are we getting this thing powered up? Are we just going to go with manual attachments, kind of like with Dracos VMAX, or are we playing other ways to cheat energies into play? And largely speaking, I think we're just going to be content with playing manual attachments, but I could see a world where we're playing some copies of Turbo Patch, new item card we're going to be talking about later in this set review, to cheat an extra energy into play here and there. I think that's fine. We probably have the space to do that as well. But I think to really get at the heart of what that question is asking is, no, I don't think we're going to be playing Weavile with like red and blue or something like that. I don't think we're playing Hydreigon. I don't think we're playing like Darkrai Prism with energy switches or any of that stuff. I think we're either just going in purely with manual attachments or we're playing some copies of Turbo Patch. But overall, guys, I'm really excited for Eternatus VMAX. I think this thing's going to get set up pretty easily. It has a lot of great support in the format too. So overall, big thumbs up for me. Really excited to start testing with the Eternatus VMAX. Next up, we have another Pokemon VMAX line to look at, and that is going to be Scizor VMAX. And of course, guys, before we get to the VMAX, let's look at the base form here. Scizor is a basic Pokemon, of course, 210 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 2 Retreat. And its first attack here for a Metal Energy is 30 damage, and you discard 1 Pokemon Tool and 1 Special Energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. And its second attack for 2 Metal and Colorless is 140. So I'm really not too impressed with the second attack, but I actually do like the first attack here on Scizor V. I think there's actually consideration for this to even be a card that sees play on its own outside of the context of a Scizor VMAX deck. So in the past, we've seen things like Cobalion EX see play for a very similar attack that wasn't quite as good as this. Same thing, we saw Drampa GX in the past see play. But to be fair, Drampa was played more for its heavy hitting attack and not its disruptive attack like this. But nevertheless, I do think there's a world where we are going to consider playing Scizor V, just as probably a one of tech. We're getting plenty of good special energies. We just got a bunch of great ones in Rebel Clash. We're getting 3 more new special energies in this set, and there's still a bunch of other previously existing ones. Definitely a lot of good special energies, and we are only going to be getting more as they keep printing more of these new type-specific special energies. So Scizor V, I think this is a card that everyone should probably pick up just to have on hand in case they need this as a tech option. So I think this first attack on Scizor is kind of okay. So looking ahead though to the Scizor VMAX, Scizor of course is a VMAX 320 HP, pretty much from there similar stats, the Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, to Retreat. Has 2 different attacks, first of which for a Metal and Colorless is 90, and during your next turn, this Pokemon takes 30 less damage from attacks. And then its second attack for 2 Metal and Colorless is 190. I think this card is actually pretty underpowered if I have to be honest. I'm going to use the comparison I've been using all throughout this set review, where if I'm attacking for 3 energy, especially if it's on a Metal Pokemon of all things, why would I not just play Zacian? It can hit for 230 for 3, has a fantastic ability to help you get set up. Hitting 190 is definitely a fair bit worse. We can't even knock out opposing Zacians, which feels pretty bad, I have to say. Now, granted, we can play things like Galarian Berserker to increase our damage output, but we're going to need at least 2 Galarian Berserkers in play if we're going to want to do that. So I think if we're playing Scizor V, I think we're just kind of doubling down on the damage reduction healing sort of strategy, just because being a 320 HP Pokemon by itself is actually pretty decent. And taking 30 less damage basically gives you effectively 350 max HP. And luckily, even though we're losing Metal Frying Pan, which actually is kind of a pain, there's still a number of other ways we can increase our tankability even more. Lucario Melmetal GX is definitely one of the big ones. We're going to have a 30 reduction for the rest of the game. Combined with the Hard Scissors attack, we're basically taking 60 less every time our opponent attacks into us. And then that's not counting other things like Metal Goggles or even the Metal Core Barrier as well, if you want to go that route. That actually sounds kind of appealing the more I'm kind of just talking about it right here. So that sort of makes sense to me. And I think that's sort of the route we would be attempting to be going if we're playing this Scizor. But again, the issue is that we're just not hitting hard enough with Scizor VMAX. Maybe my attitude will change once I get some hands-on time with Scizor, but I've kind of outlined some deck building ideas. Like I said, we have the Galarian Berserker. We of course have Metal Saucer to get up and running. The energy cost is a non-issue. basically. And we still have a ton of damage reducing options in the format as well. I will reiterate again, we are losing Metal Frying Pan, which is definitely a bit of a bummer. But luckily, Scizor does have some colorless energy in its attack cost, which means we can use weakness guard energy if we are still adamant about eliminating that weakness. That is something I do like. But it just seems like you have to run so many cards in your deck to sort of make up for the deficiencies that the Scizor VMAX deck will sort of inherently have. So I can't say I'm a big fan. I like Scizor V more than the VMAX, so I think I'm going to ultimately vote this down, but I'm still going to test with this thing and see how it does. But just, I'm not particularly impressed with Scizor compared to some of the other VMAX we've been looking at in this set review. Next up, we're going to be looking at Aggron, which is a new Stage 2 Pokemon we're getting. It has 160 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 3 Retreat cost. And it has this ability, Sturdy. If this Pokemon has full HP and would be knocked out by damage from an attack, this Pokemon is not knocked out and its remaining HP becomes 10. So my first reaction to this card was like, man, Aggron really didn't get much of an HP boost in the Sword and Shield era. I expected this card to have like 180 HP, just given how tanky Aggron is. And I think there's some Sun and Moon era cards that have 170, so kind of weird the HP they went with. But honestly, the HP is pretty irrelevant with this ability. But the big thing that I think really makes me bummed out about Aggron is the fact that we have things like Galarian Zigzagoon in the format to easily get that 10 chip damage in first to sort of nullify the entire ability. Now, granted, we do have Stealthy Hood in the format, and I think if you were going to attempt to play Aggron, I think that's actually probably your go-to tool card, just because the damage reducing cards that Metal Pokemon would usually want, like Metal Goggles, really don't even matter when you survive a hit no matter what with this ability anyways. So I think you're probably content playing just a couple copies of Stealthy Hood to make sure that your opponent can't get in that chip damage. And I think it's going to be necessary given how popular Zigzagoon is as a Pokemon. And of course, looking at this attack too, I think a lot of people might be thinking about, why are we even talking about Aggron? It's a stage 2 with a 4 energy attack cost. And that's really just because we have triple acceleration energy and also twin energy to a lesser extent. So with 1 Metal Saucer and your triple acceleration energy for turn, we can get this guy up and running pretty quickly. Hitting 160 is also something I don't like about this card. I really wish this was 180, because while a lot of the VMAXs do have 320 HP, we're seeing some, like the new Eternatus VMAX, have over that much, and we would actually need to 3-shot some of those VMAXs without the help of any other sort of damage modifying cards. So I think the damage on this attack is actually the thing that is ultimately going to make me downvote this, believe it or not. I actually think I would probably remain a little bit more neutral, but the fact that we have to run some sort of damage modifying card to safely 2-shot some of these other Pokemon VMAX that are coming out, means I think we're probably just going to be too cramped on space to fit in everything that we need to have a functioning deck. Again, I really just wish this was 170 or 180. That would be so much better. But unfortunately, guys, that is not the case. I think it's going to be what ultimately makes me give this a thumbs down and pass on this. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon V, and that's going to be Galarian Stunfisk V. So this is a basic Pokemon with 200 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 4 Retreat cost. 4 Retreat cost, of course, important to keep in mind, just because we can use things like Buff Padding or Pokemaniac. But Stunfisk here has this ability. This Pokemon's max HP is increased by 20 for each metal energy attached to it. And then its attack here, just 1 attack, 2 colorless energy to 60. And if this Pokemon is damaged by an attack during your opponent's next turn, put 12 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. And unlike something like Giant Bomb, there's not really any restriction on this attack here. If they even just do 10 damage to you, they have to take 12 damage. So it's going to be very difficult for them to play around you. I think one of the only ways they could really do that is if, you know, they're spreading damage counters and not doing direct damage. And while I was coming through the card pool, there's actually a surprising amount of different cards that synergize very well with Stunfisk. And kind of what I'm envisioning is that you're not playing this, I don't think, in like a Zacian deck or anything like this. I think this is probably its own sort of thing here. And you have a couple different ways to go. You can sort of capitalize on the defensive aspects of Stunfisk, or you can go a more aggressive route. So what I mean by that is, if you want to be more aggressive, you can actually double down on this sort of punishment by playing Giant Bombs with your Galarian Stunfisk V and make them take potentially 220 damage if they attack into you, which would be absolutely insane. So if they do that and you do the base 60 damage, that's knocking out a tag team and effectively 1 hit when you think about it. So I think that's an option. Or you can sort of double down on your defensive strategy and make them just have to attack into you more times than normal. So instead of going the giant bomb strategy, you could double down on defensive options like Metal Core Barrier or Metal Goggles, Lucario Metal GX, and just playing a bunch of metal energies, maybe even some weakness guard energies since you are weak to fire. And I really do like the colorless attack cost on this because it does open you up to playing not only metal energy, but things like weakness guard, like I just mentioned, or capture energy, recycle energy, draw energy, whatever it might be that you might want to play in addition to this. So my reaction to seeing this card is actually, I feel like it seems kind of decent, but I will say this, I have seen nothing coming out of Japan of Galarian Stunfisk V doing well, so that's probably a sign this card is not the greatest. But I do still like a lot of aspects about this card. Your opponent might just be able to play around it. Maybe they just play boss's orders and just avoid your giant damage counter punishment that you would otherwise sort of inflict on them if they just directly attack into you. The fact that I think the ball is in your opponent's court to play around this sort of just opens up, I think, for good players to be able to manage getting around these Stunfisks here. I think my gut tells me Stunfisk is not going to be the best card in the world, but I think there's just so many cards that synergize well with this that it warrants some exploration, and I think it has some degree of potential still. Next up, we have a new Copperajah we're going to be taking a look at. Copperajah is a Stage 1 Pokemon, has 190 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a Forward Tree Cost, which, of course, guys, we do need to keep in mind for buff padding. But it has this ability, this Pokemon can't be affected by special conditions, and its only attack here for 2 metal and 2 colorless does 120, and if any of your bench Pokemon have any damage counters on them, this attack does 120 more damage. So first, let's go over the good about this card. 190 HP on a Stage 1, absolutely fantastic. That is wonderful. And that's without factoring in other things like Lucario Melmetal, any of the other metal sort of damage reducing cards. So I really like the tank ability of Copperajah here. And the attack, despite it being a 4 energy attack cost, really is still like a 3 attack cost just because twin energy is a thing. And I think the requirement of this attack to do more damage really is pretty easy to fulfill. You just play 1 or 2 Spirit Tombs in your list. That way you can always ensure that you have a Pokemon in play with some damage counters on the bench. So I think you actually set up Copperajah pretty consistently, to be honest, guys. 240 is also a pretty good number to hit for. You can knock out base form Pokemon V and 2-shot VMAXs. So I think you have a lot of good things going for you. Now, of course, you guys probably know where I'm going with this, though. If you're playing a metal Pokemon that's hitting for approximately 230, 220, 240, why aren't we just playing Zacian V? It's a basic, fantastic ability, does basically the same amount of damage. With that being said, guys, there's still a part of me that does like this Copperajah. This is a card I initially wrote off very, very quickly, but the more thought I've put into it, the more I've kind of come around a little bit on the card. Especially since we are getting the new Decidueye in this set. That is going to be a pain for the different Pokemon GX and Pokemon V-based decks. Copperajah actually, I think, has some sliver of hope as being maybe even a potential one prizer to play around Decidueye. I think that's one of the bigger, more practical applications we could see. So normally I would probably say Copperajah is going to be a little bit outclassed, but I do like the fact that this gives the metal decks, a decent answer to the potential Decidueye decks. And also, even if you were to build around this on its own, while I don't know if I'm convinced that's like a super competitive idea, I think all the pieces are there for it to exist and to be a thing. So the card's not horrible. It's not amazing. It's not even a card that is going to see widespread play by any means. But like I said, I think it has enough going for it where there is a potential argument to be made to potentially play this in some sort of capacity at some point. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan, of course, is a basic Pokemon, 130 HP, fighting weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. And we're really just honing in on this first attack, Retaliate for 2 colorless energy, just 30, plus 90 more if any of your Pokemon were knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack during their last turn. So this attack has been an attack we've seen throughout the years. I think some of the more notable examples of an attack like this seeing success are going to be the Bouffalant back from Black and White, the Druddigon back from the XY area, Terrakion back from Noble Victory. So these attacks have been pretty decent in the past. However, I think Kangaskhan's like slightly worse than those just because all of those Pokemon could one-shot or two-shot basically any Pokemon in the format. I think Retaliate's a little bit underpowered for today compared to those cards. You know, if we were hitting for 160, I think I would actually be a really big fan of this. But since we're not, it's going to be a little bit harder for me to recommend this. The practical application I could see for Kangaskhan is if you're already a deck that's playing some copies of Twin Energy, or maybe you're even a Welder-based deck, just as an example. You could theoretically slide in one of these Kangaskhan's. They're easy to get powered up. You know, especially in the case of Welder, a lot of the Welder targets are going to take 3 energy. Kangaskhan only needs 2, which is nice. Something like Rillaboom can also power this up just for 1 ability. You don't need any additional attachments beyond that. So I think there's a world where you play this, especially like I've kind of referenced with a couple different cards in this set review, if the Decidueye does start to sort of catch on and you need a way to better deal with a card like that, Kangaskhan could theoretically be an okay sort of answer in that sort of respect. But I'm really not too excited about Kangaskhan. This is a card I was really teetering on between giving a bad rating and giving a neutral rating. But I think overall I'm going to wind up leaning a little bit closer to downvoting Kangaskhan, just because this attack can't consistently two-shot things, and that's really it. I think if this was 160, I would actually be like right there in the middle on this card, maybe even leaning closer to saying it's good. But because it's only 120, in a lot of cases, that's going to be a 3-shot for certain decks out there. So as a result, I'm not sure Kangaskhan's going to be quite as impactful as it otherwise would have been. Next up, guys, we have Salamence VMAX, which is going to be the very last of the Pokemon VMAX in this set review. So, of course, before we look at the VMAX, let's look at the base form Salamence V. And its first attack here for 3 colorless energy is 30 to each of your opponent's Pokemon. That second attack for 4 colorless does 160. So I actually kind of do like the first attack, kind of similar to the old Glaciate attack we saw in Kyurem back from Noble Victories. Granted, this also isn't 2011, so 30 spread, not quite as good as it once was. But nevertheless, I do think this is nice. It actually sets up some decent math with the primary attack on Salamence VMAX, so I think this is fine. And then on Salamence VMAX, let's take a look at this. 320 HP, Lightning Weakness, Fighting Resistance to Retreat Cost. All sort of standard stats to see so far. But its first attack here for a colorless energy is 40 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. And then its main attack for 4 colorless energy does 240. And during your next turn, this Pokemon can't use this attack. So Salamence VMAX has been a card that's been very difficult for me to place just because it has a lot of options at its disposal. But because there's so many things you want to fit in one deck, that's been something I've been kind of struggling with in terms of nailing down what a consistent sort of deck for Salamence might look like. I think one of the best things about Salamence is the fact that it's so flexible in terms of the energy that it can use. Of course, we can use triple acceleration energy, which is really great for the second attack here. Of course, we can abuse Welder. I think that's going to be probably the best form of energy acceleration I can foresee with this. I think either that or Rose are definitely both options. If you do go down the Rose engine route, you open yourself up to being able to play any type of energy, which might allow you to play some other different attackers in your Salamence deck. So I think that's an option to keep in mind. But I think most people's heads are going towards Welder first and foremost. We're getting the new special colorless energy, which is going to increase our damage by 20, which is also, I think, really important for Salamence because right now it's just shy of doing the damage that it needs to be doing. 240 is fine, but you're not knocking out any tag teams. It's really only good against the base form Pokemon V, like Zacian V, just as an easy example. But if we're going down like the Welder route as an example, we also want to play triple acceleration. We also want to play the new powerful energy, but then that digs into your energy cards for consistency, which is a little bit problematic because then your Welders aren't going to work quite as often as you would like, unless you're just playing an absolutely humongous energy count. So I guess from here, if we're thinking about playing Salamence VMAX, especially if we are thinking about the Welder engine, that's sort of the main one. Again, I want to reiterate that a lot of people are thinking about if we're playing a Welder-based VMAX deck and we are going for 2 shots or even a 1-shot for that matter, what's the incentive to play this over Centiskorch and over Charizard? I think Centiskorch and Charizard both are going to be much more consistent when it comes to one-shotting Pokemon. I think the big advantage Salamence has, however, is the fact that you aren't quite as reliant on Welder. You really just need to Welder like 1 energy if you need to, and attach a triple acceleration energy. But for me, without getting hands-on time with Salamence, I'm closer to being in the camp that I'd rather just play Centiskorch or Charizard. But I think with the fact that Pikarom is getting severely hurt by the rotation and that we're getting several new strong fire Pokemon in Darkness Ablaze, I think that opens up some potential for water Pokemon to creep back into the format. And if that happens, those other Welder-based VMAX decks become a little less appealing, and Salamence VMAX, I think, has some potential to sort of carve out a space of its own to exist in the metagame, despite it sort of being awkward to climb up to the damage I think it really wants to be hitting for. I think I'm ultimately going to fall a little bit more on the neutral side when it comes to Salamence VMAX. I think this is kind of a solid card, but again, if we're playing a VMAX deck that is with a welder engine, right now I think I'm more in the camp of wanting to play something like Centiskorch or Charizard over something like this. And for that reason, I'm still going to remain neutral. I'm kind of cautiously optimistic for the future of this card. So next up, guys, we have another sort of a gimmicky archetype that Darkness Ablaze is going to be pushing. And this time it's going to be the Bird Keeper attackers, or Sky Circus attackers, whatever you want to call this thing. But basically, there's a couple of different Pokemon in this set that all have this Sky Circus ability. If you played Bird Keeper from your hand during this turn, ignore all energy and the attack costs of this Pokemon. So before we get to the individual Pokemon, let's just quickly go over what Bird Keeper is going to do. Bird Keeper, of course, is a supporter card. You switch your active with one of your bench Pokemon, then draw 3 cards. So not a horrible card by any means, but it's basically like a slightly better version of something like Hop, though Hop isn't really one of the better supporters we have access to right now. This is more of a card that's just kind of a necessary evil we might have to play if we do want to play the Bird Keeper deck. So there are 3 different Pokemon in this set that have this Sky Circus ability. That's going to be Rowlet, Starly, and Swanna. But to be honest, guys, I really don't think Starly or Rowlet are particularly good. I think Swanna is really the one that looks the most appealing out of all of the ones that we can go over. So I'm going to have translations on screen, of course, for the other ones. But the one I really want to focus in on for the bulk of this conversation is going to be Swanna. So Swanna has a 0 retreat cost, which is already pretty important just because Bird Keeper is going to force us to switch, and just free retreat in general is always kind of a nice thing. But it has this attack for 3 colorless energy to 70, and you may discard 1 card from your hand. If you do, this does 70 more damage. So when I was first thinking about this, I was like, 140 damage isn't that great. You can't even 2-shot a lot of the VMAXs, but I was thinking 140 for 0 doesn't sound too bad though. So that's kind of what's attracted me to this thing. I think actually you can probably play a deck that plays very few energies just in general. I think you could probably just play maybe some copies of Triple Acceleration Energy, maybe even some copies of the new powerful Colorless Energy to maybe increase your damage output to sort of that magical 160 to 180 sort of damage range. So I really do like the flexibility that this whole engine sort of gives your deck. It opens up a lot of space, allows you to place basically whatever energies that you want to, and I really do like that about it. And I think if this whole sort of package ever does see any play, that's kind of the reason why. Of course, we have things like Palpad to recycle Bird Keeper over and over if we do want to. We have Eldegoss V as well. But guys, I do have to confess, I'm still not quite sold on this. Maybe this is one of those cards or decks that I'm going to eat my words on later. But I have to say, I think I'm ultimately still going to downvote this entire sort of package of attackers and cards that we're working with. Just because 140 just isn't the best of numbers. And the whole deck is based around a supporter card that just isn't very good. Like if you played Professor's Research from your hand during this turn, well, I mean, I might be a little bit more excited since that's a supporter I don't mind building my whole engine around. Overall, I'm not too crazy about all of these cards. I think they're okay, but I just don't think they're actually competitive, and that's really what's going to make me downvote them. If you're going to play one of the gimmick deck that is popping up out of Darkness Ablaze, I think the Mad Party deck looks a little bit more enticing. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Greedent card. Greedent is a stage 1, 120 HP, fighting weakness, 1 retreat, has 2 different attacks here. The first of which for a colorless energy is 20, and before doing any damage you discard tools attached to your opponent's active. But more interestingly, its second attack here has the hit and run attack for 2 colors is 100, and you return this Pokemon and all cards attached to it to your hand. So much like this attack name would suggest, this is a new style like hit and run attacker, kind of similar to things of the past like Hitmonchan, Donphan, or the Beheeyem, or more Pico V in recent memory as well. And the attack cost is something I really do like about this because it's only 2, which means of course we can play Twin Energy, and if we want to we can play some copies of Triple Acceleration Energy as well. So we can maybe play like 4 Twin Energy, 2 Triple, something like that, just to basically always ensure we can draw our energies when we need them. And this card initially reminded me a lot of Beheeyem, but the trade-off is you have a better attack cost, you do more damage, but of course you aren't item locking your opponent. That is definitely the big thing that I really don't like about Greedent, but I still think there is some potential here. We do have a good bit of wall Pokemon in the format. We have, of course, Lily's Pokédoll, that's going to be the big one. We also have my boy Galarian Cursula, one of my favorite cards that's actually in the current format. Big fan of that card that came out in Rebel Clash. So of course we can try to do something like that. You know, I'm not sure if you can fit something like this in the deck, but you could also play something like the new Decidueye that's coming out. Or if the new Altaria does wind up being shoehorned into this set, which is kind of unclear at the time of recording, that's also going to be another wall option as well. The big thing I don't like about Greedent, however, is the damage output. That's the big thing that's really sort of losing me. If you're going against a VMAX, you're going to have to 4-shot them, which is like absolutely dumb. Like I really don't want to have to 4-shot something. I think if you're playing Greedent, you might need to be playing some sort of additional like cleanup attacker to maybe clean up some knockouts. Maybe something like the Kangaskhan we looked at earlier that can help hit that magic sort of 320 mark it might need to. Or maybe even the new Glycopod we looked at earlier in this set review as well. Since Glycopod has an insanely heavy hitting attack for just a single twin energy potentially. So there's definitely some aspects to Greedent that are not quite ideal. And if we can successfully sort of overcome those, I think really just finding a good cleanup attacker in whatever theoretical deck we're building with this is going to be the big thing. If we can pull that off, then I think Greedent's actually kind of a good card. If not, I'm not so sold on Greedent. It's I'm actually pretty polarized in terms of where I can fall on this overall. So I think just naturally that's going to sort of put me somewhere in the middle here. I think I really just need to get hands-on time with this card and try to experiment with building around this before I can give you an answer on if this thing is actually competitively viable. I think it has potential, but that's about where I'm going to stop on this card for the moment. Alrighty guys, so next up we have the final Pokemon of the entire Darkness Ablaze set review, and that is going to be a new Corviknight. So Corviknight, stage 2 Pokemon of course, lightning weakness, fighting resistance to retreat, and it has this ability that we're going to be honing in on. Once during your turn, whenever you play this card from hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may choose one of your Pokemon, excluding Corviknight, and return that Pokemon all cards attached to it to your hand. So at a glance, this kind of just looks like Scoop Up Net on a stage 2, which is, you know, I think for the most part kind of accurate. But one of the upsides to Corviknight over something like Scoop Up Net is that you can use this even on Pokemon GX and Pokemon V and VMAX, which I think is actually kind of a selling point, to be honest. You know, if we're playing Corviknight, I'm thinking this is maybe more of like a healing option we might have for VMAXs. Kind of the issue I'm having with that though is that we don't really have any VMAXs that can attack for just a single energy. Like most of them have like a 3+ attack cost. You know, certain things like Salamence VMAX have a single energy attack that just does like a 40 snipe, which is, you know, kind of okay. But I think if we're playing this, we really want an attacker that we can pick up, slam down with just one energy and keep on attacking. And I just don't think we have something like that right now. I think that's really the big issue. So for right now, I have to say, I'm actually not the biggest fan of Corviknight. I think since we don't have something like Max Potion in the format, and if we had one of these tag teams or VMAXs, like I said, that could just easily quickly attack for a single attachment, Corviknight I think would be much more enticing. But since that's not the case, I can't really stand behind this. So even though it's a stage 2, and of course I have my soft spot for stage 2s, I don't think the partner that Corviknight wants currently exists. Next up guys, we're going to be looking at our first trainer card of the set review, and that is going to be Adversity Gloves. And really quick, I do want to point out this is actually one of 2 different cards that I'm unsure if will make the cut to make it into Darkness Ablaze, but nevertheless I wanted to cover it just in case. So anyways, with that being said, if we do get Adversity Gloves, let's take a look at what the card does. It's a Pokemon tool card, and it says if the weakness of the Pokemon this card is attached to is the same type as your opponent's active Pokemon, its attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon before applying weakness and resistance. So this is actually kind of a unique card in the format right now, since we don't really have that many great damage modification options. I think the best ones that sort of come to mind for me are going to be either Vitality Band or a Galarian Zigzagoon sort of scoop up net engine combo. So having a tool that is going to give us a plus 30, much like with Choice Band of the past, is something I think is kind of worth getting excited about. Of course, it is limited just to Pokemon that you are weak to, and that might be able to kind of give you an edge and maybe prevent your matchup from being really unfavorable. In terms of my score for this card, though, it really just depends on the specific decks that exist in the format. And right now, at the time of recording, we don't really have a clear idea exactly what post-rotation is going to look like. So it's hard for me to really commit one way or the other on this card. The way I see it is, if you have an unfavorable matchup where your opponent can one-shot you and you have to two-shot them, and this 30 damage can make a difference and allow you to keep up with the tempo of the game, then yeah, I actually do like adversity gloves. I really do like it in those specific instances. But again, without having a clear idea of what the post-rotation format looks like at the time of recording this segment, it's really hard to say if such a specific instance like that is going to present itself after Darkness Ablaze releases. So I think this card has promise, mainly just because our damage modification options are so bad. We kind of have to take what we can get at this point, since we don't really have that many other options at our disposal. Next up, we have Big Parasol. This is a Pokemon tool card, and it says, as long as the Pokemon this card is attached to is your active Pokemon, prevent all effects of your opponent's attacks except damage done to all of your Pokemon, and existing effects are not removed. So this is actually a pretty cool card. I do like this card, actually. So what does this mean by effects? I think one of the biggest examples that immediately comes to mind for me is Dracos VMAX. So Dracos VMAX hits you for 130 and spreads 5 damage counters on your bench. And the 5 damage counters is actually technically an effect of an attack if you are a deck that struggles with Dracos VMAX, maybe like the Mad Party deck that we looked at in this set review, just as an easy example, where all of your attackers are very low HP. You're going to need a way to prevent against that. Mew, of course, doesn't do a great job at preventing that. The Galarian Mr. Rhyme that we have in format already requires you to have energy. So this is actually probably our best way at combating against stuff like that. Now, of course, this will prevent other things like status conditions, gusting effects, energy removal, etc., all from attacks. And I can definitely see a world where this card does see play. The fact that it applies to all of your Pokemon is what I think really makes me like this card a lot. It does have to be in the active spot, of course, but I think that's a price kind of worth paying if it means you get to protect all of your Pokemon in the process. Of course, your opponent can attempt to sort of gust around this, or maybe just use a tool scrapper to get rid of it. But I have to say, overall, I like this card. I definitely see some very practical applications where this can come in handy. So big fan of Big Parasol here. Next up, we have the Birdkeeper supporter we talked about briefly earlier in the set review, but it's a new supporter card. You switch your active with one of your bench Pokemon, then draw 3 cards. So pretty straightforward. It's kind of like Hop, but a little bit better because you get a switching effect in the process, which is cool. So obviously this would see play in the Birdkeeper deck, but outside of that, you guys are probably wondering, is there any real reason to play this card? And maybe pre-rotation, I would have tried to make an argument for this just because you could have played this with Jirachi, you could have switched into Jirachi, drawn 3 cards, then get the Stellar Wish on top of that. Something like that would have been really nice, I think. But in the post-rotation format, that's not really the case since we are losing a skateboard. Maybe once the amazing rare Jirachi eventually comes out, we can sort of revisit that sort of idea. But I have to say overall, guys, I'm not really a big fan of this. Next up, we have Cheer Yellhorn. It's an item card. Each player's active is now confused. So while confusion is kind of an okay status condition to inflict here, your opponent can just retreat out of it. Switching cards are being played in very high counts in a number of different decks. We have Scoop Up Net seeing a lot of play in a lot of different decks as well. So there's a good case to be made that if you confuse your opponent's active, the confusion's not even going to stick. And then from there, even if it does stick and they don't retreat, you still have to flip to see if they're even going to take damage for the turn. I think if we're playing Cheer Yellhorn, this would be more of a card that would see play because you specifically want to inflict them with a special condition, maybe some sort of card that does more damage for each special condition that's affecting the Pokemon, or maybe you're playing something weird like the Parasect that puts damage counters on confused Pokemon. I think that's more or less the sort of instance where this card has some sort of utility. But one thing is annoying too, your active is also confused, so you have to find a way to retreat for turn if you don't want to have to flip a coin to attack. So yeah, I'm not crazy about this card overall. This is another one of those cards where maybe if we still had a skateboard, we could justify playing this in some deck just because you could use this, your Jirachi would be confused, then you just retreat out of your active spot with the skateboard into your attacker. But Without a skateboard, that's not even really the case. I guess you could pull off the same play with Scoop Up Net, but guys, I think you can see I'm kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel here. Really not a big fan of Cheer Yellhorn. Next up, we have Glimwood Tangle. This is a new stadium card, and this is one I do want to mention that has a chance of being cut from Darkness Ablaze to be held for our holiday set. So we'll have to see if this does make it into Darkness Ablaze, but since Dreadnought VMAX is being cut from this set, and there are some other cards that sort of tie in with Glimwood Tangle thematically in the holiday set, there is a chance, like I said, that this could skip Darkness Blaze. But if it does make it into the set, let's take a look at it. It says, once during either player's turn, after they flip any coins for an attack, that player may ignore all results of those coin flips and begin flipping those coins again. So one of the downsides to the Pokemon trading card game just in general is that there are cards that are fairly luck-based and that require you to flip coins or sometimes even multiple coins to get an effect off of a card. And I think just in general, having that element of luck present in the game isn't a good thing. And if there are ways we can sort of skew those effects to work more consistently, I think that's a great thing. And here we have Glimwood Tangle sort of filling that role that the old Fliptini filled all the way back from the Noble Victories days. So I'm excited to have Glimwood Tangle in the format here. Granted, it's not quite as easy to get in play as Victini since it's a stadium and we can't just sort of quick ball for it if we want it. But nevertheless, it being a trainer card, I think generally is going to be fine. There's countless Pokemon in the format that have coin flip attacks. We looked at the Toxicity from this set. There's even a random Xatu we still have in the format where if you flip heads, you can put your opponent down to 10 health left. So there are no shortage of cards that do want to increase their odds of flipping heads on their attacks. So overall, I'm a fan of Glimwood Tangle. I think this is a good card for the game just to have in general. And with the precedent set by the old Victini seeing pretty decent amount of play whenever it came out, means that I think there is some hope here for Glimwood Tangle to see play. So I'm a fan of this one. Next up, we have a new supporter card, and that's going to be Kabu. Kabu says, shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 4 cards. If you only have one Pokemon to play, draw 8 cards instead. So while Shuffle and Draw 8 is admittedly pretty impressive, especially since we're losing something like Cynthia, which is just a Shuffle and Draw 6, I think this card is just way too limited in terms of the amount of different times in the game where you can actually draw 8 with this. To actually make this card worth considering playing. So, I mean, just at the beginning of the game, a lot of times you'll open up with more than one basic Pokemon in your hand right away. So congrats, you can't play Kabu unless you just want to shuffle and draw 4, which is really, really bad. Just to put in perspective, people played Judge in the past, and Marnie now, to put their opponent at 4 cards. Drawing 4 cards is seen as a punishment. So if we aren't drawing 8, drawing 4 is just really, really bad. Maybe if this was like Shuffle Draw 5, I'd consider making a case for Kabu, but draw 4 I think is just too poor. So yeah, this is a card I'm going to give a pretty big thumbs down on actually. Next up, we're going to be looking at Lookalike Bell. Lookalike Bell is a new item card. It says search your deck for a Pokemon with the same name as a Pokemon in your discard pile, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is definitely a really unique form of search. It's kind of like the old Repeat Ball, but of course it's from discard rather than in play. But Repeat Ball actually did see some play for a little bit in that weird sort of time frame where we didn't have Level Ball. So I think based on that alone, Lookalike Bell has some sort of precedent set for it to maybe be decent. I think the big application for this right out of the gate though is going to be for the Mad Party deck. Since you're trying to consistently discard all of your attackers, Lookalike Bell is going to be nice at finding those other ones out of your deck whenever you might need them. So I think this makes sense in that deck. Outside of that, I'm not quite sure if I like this in many other situations. I mean, we still have Quick Ball, we have Pokemon Communication, Evolution Incense, etc. We still have plenty of pretty decent searching options. So I think the uses for Lookalike Bell are going to be fairly narrow. It's going to be, I think, decks that aren't playing a ton of different Pokemon. And outside of the Mad Party deck, I'm not sure if there's one that really jumps out at me. I think it's only fair to rate this at least the same as I rated the Mad Party deck. So I was kind of neutral on that one. So as a result, I'm kind of neutral on this one. You'll almost assuredly play in the Mad Party deck. It just remains to be seen if there's going to be decks outside of that that would like something like this. Next up, we have another Pokemon tool card that is going to be Mountainous Smoke. When the Pokemon this card is attached to is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, your opponent puts any prize cards they picked into their discard pile instead of their hand. So this kind of reminds me of Burst GX on Blacephalon GX, very similar style of effect. Of course, this is going to be on a tool. It affects your opponent rather than yourself, but kind of the same sort of vibe overall. Now, unlike Burst GX, I'm not a big fan of this Pokemon tool card. Just in general, it's a pretty passive effect. It only triggers whenever your opponent does something, which means your opponent can kind of play around this. They can tool scrapper it without you getting any effect of it. And if you're playing a tool like that, I think the effect of it needs to be pretty good. Think of something like Giant Bomb, just as an example. If your opponent does play into it, then yeah, that's a pretty big upside. They're going to take 100 damage. But the upside of this is that they're just going to discard some cards they already didn't have access to up until this point anyways. Realistically, I can't see myself justifying playing this in any deck. You know, maybe there's some sort of weird gimmicky deck that comes out down the road that could abuse something like this in some sort of weird convoluted combo. But the vast majority of decks aren't playing this. Your Zacian decks aren't playing this. Your Baby Blacephalon decks aren't playing this. Your Centiskorch VMAX isn't playing this, etc., etc. So I think this card is just a straight meme. I don't think it's very good. Next up, we have Old Computer, which is a new item card. You flip 2 coins. If both are heads, choose 1 card from discard pile, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Ugh, man, this is pretty bad, I do have to say, guys. Even if this was just flip 1 coin, half the time this card is going to do nothing. Like, we're already pretty picky about playing trainer cards that have you flip coins at all, let alone flip 2 coins. That's going to make it even harder to get any effect off of this. Now, to be fair, the actual effect of Old Computer is really good. Getting any card from your discard pile and putting it straight into your hand, that's definitely good. There's a lot of things I would like to get back from my discard pile at any given point in a game. So if this was just flip 1 coin, yeah, we'd probably actually be playing Old Computer. This would actually be a pretty decent card. But the fact that it's flip 2 coins means more often than not, this is just going to be 1 to 4 dead cards in your deck. So yeah, gonna have to pass on Old Computer here. Alrighty guys, next up we have another good trainer card. That's going to be Peers. So it says search your deck for 1 dark Pokemon and 1 energy. Reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So yeah, I think this card is easily sort of a slam dunk here. It's kind of like the newest iteration of the Korrina, Volkner style of supporter cards we've had over the years. So this is actually really good. Like, not only does this make sense just generally in dark decks, to search out your attackers, but the fact that we're getting Crobat V in the same set, which is dark type, makes Peers a much better card, because I kind of think that almost opens up the possibility of playing like a Peers engine for other decks that just happen to run Crobat V. Because one thing that's important to point out here, it doesn't say dark energy. It's any energy card, which means, like I said, you can suddenly kind of craft this weird engine for your deck based on Crobat V and what other energies you might be playing. So we can even search special energies, not just basic ones. So we can get the new special dark energy that's coming out in this set, which of course is going to make sense in stuff like Eternatus. But we can also get other things like twin energy, triple acceleration, other basic energies, etc. And I think that's really, really cool. Even though your searching effects are sort of limited and you're not seeing too many cards, if you grab Crobat off of Peers, you can not only grab yourself an energy for turn, but also draw potentially up to 6 other cards as well. So I'm a big fan of this one. At the very least, I'm sure it will see play in the Eternatus decks coming out of Darkness Ablaze. Next up, we have Pokemon Breeders Nurturing. It's a new support card. It says choose up to 2 of your Pokemon in play, search your deck for a card that evolves from each of those Pokemon, and put it on top of the Pokemon to evolve it. Then shuffle your deck. And most importantly, you can't use this card during your first turn or on a Pokemon that just came into play. So I was pretty excited about this while I was reading it until I got to like the last sentence of the card. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think Pokemon Breeders Nurturing is going to be a very good card. It's just too slow as a supporter, I think. Most of the time, you would just rather play Professor's Research, a Marnie, or a Boss's Orders. There's no shortage of better supporters to be playing this. Now, one thing I will say is kind of an upside to this card is we have to remember that VMAXs are evolution Pokemon, so we can search for VMAXs, which is pretty nice. And maybe if you're a deck that is reliant on some sort of an evolution Pokemon that is your engine, like Cincino, just as an example, or Silvally GX, or maybe you play a lot of other non-supporter based draw like Crobat V or the new Rose Tower, maybe there's a case to be made for Pokemon Breeders Nurturing, but I think just generally speaking, this card's going to be far too slow. Unfortunately, as much as I love my evolutions, I'm going to have to pass on this one. Next up, we have Rare Fossil, which is the newest sort of iteration of the fossil mechanic. And largely speaking, this is going to be pretty much unchanged from the unidentified fossil. So just to catch you up on the mechanic, you play this card as if it were a 70 HP colorless basic Pokemon at any time during your turn. You may discard this card from play, and this card can't retreat and isn't affected by status conditions. So it's effectively the same as what we've had, but we are getting a slight HP boost. So I think Rare Fossil is probably the best iteration of the fossil mechanic we've had recently. So for that reason, I'm going to upvote it. I mean, this card's really, to be honest, only as good as the quality of fossil Pokemon that we're going to be getting. I know in Darkness Ablaze we have Arxol, which has some degree of potential, but in the short term, I'm not sure how much play Rare Fossil is actually going to see. But just in terms of the fossil mechanic as a whole, I think this mechanic is easy to sort of play around. It just, like I said, depends on the quality of fossil Pokemon that we're going to be getting. Next up, we have another support card called Rose that says choose up to 2 basic energy from your discard pile and attach them to one of your Pokemon VMAX. Then discard your hand. Definitely some pretty big pros and cons to this card, if I do say so. I'm a big fan of generic energy acceleration like this. That way it kind of ensures any type of Pokemon has a chance at getting powered up with some sort of engine. Of course, it is only limited to VMAXs, but I'm still excited to see something like this. And of course, it does need to be said, discarding your hand is a pretty big drawback though. That's definitely something we have to sort of play around if we are going to attempt to play something like Rose. We are getting the new Rose Tower in this set, which has pretty obvious energy with this. It'll allow you to draw until you have 3 cards in your hand. So that's one way you can refresh your hand. You can also play something like Silvally GX. And I think that's generally kind of going to be good, especially Rose Tower. That's super splashable, and basically any deck that doesn't already have like a stadium that's absolutely integral to their core strategy. So because we have Rose Tower, and because we also have Silvally GX to a lesser degree, I'm actually a fan of Rose. So while this isn't as strong as something like Welder, just as an example, it's better than something like Bead. And I'm looking forward to experimenting with this. So not, I think, the best card in the set or even the best trainer card in the set, but I think this is a solid card. And I'm looking forward to experimenting with this engine. And speaking of Rose, up next we do have Rose Tower. It's a new stadium card. It says once during either player's turn, that player may draw cards from their deck until they have 3 cards in their hand. So this is functionally just a reprint of the old Instructor Ranger back from the Sun and Moon base set, which is a card that saw a ton of play throughout its entire lifespan. You know, we even saw certain decks like the old Gramble deck play sometimes 2 or 3 copies because the effect was so good. So I'm a fan of this. This being a stadium card, I think is really cool. Of course, you're going to have to contend with things like Chaotic Swell. But needless to say, this has obvious synergy with the Rose supporter card. We need a way to refill our hand size after we dump our hand. But also, I think Rose Tower has potential even outside of decks that are playing the Rose engine. And I think that's most notably going to be for very aggressive decks. So think of something like Pikarom. I think Pikarom just in general is going to sort of fall out of favor after rotation. But I think it's a deck that sort of highlights how this could be used. So you're trying to just dig through your deck with things like the Dene, with Crobat V. You're probably already playing Guzma and Hala to be able to grab your Speed Lightning energies. With Thunder Mountain gone, you can grab Rose Tower now to keep on digging through your deck. So I think those styles of decks are going to be the ones that are going to want something like this the most. Really just any sort of aggressive, largely basic oriented deck. Also decks that are susceptible to things like Reset Stamp or even Marnie to a kind of lesser degree might consider something like Rose Tower. So while Green's decks have sort of fallen out of favor, those are the types of decks that kind of like cards like this just because they're really not seeing a lot of cards, and when their hand does get disrupted, it's very damaging. So something like Rose Tower could be good for any decks that want to attempt to abuse some sort of Green's engine. I think that's another sort of thought I've been having. So I'm a fan of this. I definitely expect us to see play, and I'm definitely going to be experimenting with this card for sure. So yeah, big fan of Rose Tower. Next up, guys, we have another stadium card, and that's going to be Spikemouth. This one says, whenever a player's Pokemon is moved from the active spot to the bench during their turn, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. So this is definitely another one of those cards that does take a little bit of a hit since a skateboard is rotating. It means Jirachis aren't going to be quite as prevalent, and they're going to be probably using scoop up nets to remove them from play if they are still playing a Jirachi engine. But I was going to say, if we still had a skateboard, Jirachis would be racking up damage whenever this thing is in play. But nevertheless, there's still a bunch of different ways where Spikemouth could be good. We did look at the Hound Doom V at the beginning of this set review, which of course, wants damage counters on some of its own Pokemon, so this is good for that. Also think of something like the Spiritomb deck, which wants to get damage counters on itself to do more damage. Obvious synergy there. And with us losing Shrine of Punishment, this is sort of the closest thing we're going to have to this. I do largely think this is going to be in decks that are revolving around some sort of strategy to inflict damage counters on its own Pokemon, just because it's sort of a passive stadium and your opponent could bump it otherwise. But nevertheless, I think it is nice being able to have the option, at least, to being able to maybe get some chip damage on your opponent throughout the game as well, if you are playing a Spikemouth in your list. So not my favorite trainer card of the set by any means, but I do think this is a solid stadium, and it does sort of fill a role that we are losing in the form of Shrine of Punishment, and also helps some already sort of proven decks and archetypes like Spiritomb, just as an example. So I'm going to stand with Spikemouth. I think it's a decent stadium. Next up, we're looking at another Pokemon tool card, and this is going to be Toughness Cape. It says the maximum HP of the basic Pokemon this card is attached to is increased by 50, excluding Pokemon GX. And I'm actually really glad they did exclude Pokemon GX, because then you would have tag teams with over 300 HP, and in some instances more HP than some of the VMAXs. So I think this was a really smart design decision. But outside of that, I think this is actually a really decent sort of Pokemon tool card. We already have Buff Patagon format, which, though has a strong effect, is just limited to Pokemon with a 4 retreat. And on the flip side, the other sort of card we have like that has been Big Charm. Big Charm, of course, is only for 30 HP. So the fact that we can get a 50 HP boost is something I think is really nice, especially since most of the Pokemon you'd be probably attaching this to anyways are going to be basic, since for better or for worse, the format is pretty dominated by basic Pokemon. That can definitely throw off the math in a lot of instances and turn those 2-hit knockouts into 3-hit knockouts. So over the years, we've seen it just a number of these cards see play. We see Fighting Fury Belt, we've seen Hard Charm. More recent months, we've seen things like Metal Frying Pan. So yeah, I think this card's kind of a slam dunk here. There's a ton of different Pokemon that would love to abuse this. Even think of some of the fire Pokemon we have, just because we're getting the new Heat Fire Energy in this set, which increases HP for fire Pokemon. Then you have Toughness Cape on top of that to further increase their HP. And actually, I will point out, this is kind of a pseudo replacement for Hustle Belt in Spiritomb decks. So effectively, when you have this attached to Spiritomb, you just increased your max damage potential by 150, which is pretty insane. So yeah, I think there's plenty of practical applications for this thing. Like I said, I think Toughness Cape is a slam dunk. Very solid tool card that we're going to be getting. And for the last of the trainer cards in our Darkness Ablaze set review, we have Turbo Patch. So Turbo Patch is an item card. Says flip a coin if heads, choose a basic energy from your discard pile and attach it to one of your basic Pokemon, excluding Pokemon GX. Big fan yet again of the Pokemon GX sort of exclusion there. That kind of ensures things like ADP can't turn 1 altered creation, which I think is definitely a good thing for the game. I think that would be pretty degenerate if you're able to do that. But that being said, I'm a big fan of Turbo Patch. You know, I've ragged on some of the coin flip cards that we've talked about in this set review already. But there's actually a lot of times where, especially in the case of item cards specifically, we don't sort of mind taking the chance with a coin flip if the benefit is as strong as something like this. So think back to cards like Pokemon Catcher, Crushing Hammer, Stadium Nav, Timer Ball. These are all item cards that are based on coin flips that still saw play just because the effects of them were so good. It kind of warrants taking the chance on them. And I definitely think Turbo Patch is another one of those. And much like in the case with Rose, I'm a big fan of giving these generic sorts of energy acceleration to all the different types out there. One thing that's also kind of interesting to point out, you can effectively run like 8 Metal Saucer in a deck now if you want to. You can run 4 Metal Saucer and 4 Turbo Patch if you want. Kind of like in the same style we've seen in Turbo Dark and Expanded, where they'll play 4 Max Elixir and 4 copies of Dark Patch. I think that's an option. I'm not sure if you need to do that, but I'm just saying you have the potential if you really want to. This is going to help basically any deck out there. Energy acceleration is one of the best effects in the game. So having just an item that you can immediately burn, and it can help any type of Pokemon out there in the game, that of course is a basic non-GX, is I think something really worth considering. So I'm a fan of Turbo Patch. I think we picked a pretty strong trainer card here to end our discussion on the trainers of Darkness Ablaze, if I do say so. Big thumbs up. I like Turbo Patch. Up next, we have Heat Fire Energy, which is the first of 3 different special energies that we're going to be getting. And this is one of the new type-specific special energies that just started recently in the Sword and Shield era. And this one's for fire Pokemon. So it provides fire energy, but while it's attached to fire Pokemon, its maximum HP is increased by 20. So I kind of already mentioned this when talking about Toughness Cape. Fire Pokemon are getting some pretty good tanking options now between this and Toughness Cape. I could especially see this seeing play with things like Centiskorch VMAX, Cinderace VMAX, etc. Any of these Fire VMAXs that are trying to tank hits. But my issue that I have with this card is the fact that it cuts into your welder consistency. Because the more of these heat fire energies you play, that means the fewer basic fire energies are in your deck, which means less odds of having the necessary energy in hand to use with Welder. And that's really the tricky part about this. I'm not actually convinced you'd be playing this as a 3 or 4 of in your fire decks. I think a common sort of count we could expect to see is maybe like a 2 count, unless fire energy counts are also getting adjusted. Also, the other question we have to ask, is the 20 damage even relevant in terms of changing the math, forcing your opponent to attack you an additional time to get a KO? So if that's not even the case, then you don't even need to play this at all to begin with. So while I like Heat Fire energy, I don't think this is a special energy every fire deck will play. It'll only be in select instances, and probably not in high counts either. My rating on this one really could have gone either way. I chose to stay in the middle on this one just because it isn't going to be as popular as something like Speed Lightning, but I do still think it will pop up and see some degree of play. Next up, we have Hide Darkness Energy. This is the special dark for darkness Pokemon. Provides dark energy, but when it is attached to a dark Pokemon, their retreat cost is 0. So this is something I actually really do like because we don't have Floatstone in the current format. Probably the next closest thing we've had has been Air Balloon. And this is just an objective upgrade to Air Balloon if you're already a deck that's playing dark energy. So one thing I really do like about this is the fact that peers will allow you to search it out. So I could definitely see this being good in Eternatus VMAX. And also just in general too, even though we have Dark City still in the format, that is only going to give our dark basic Pokemon free retreat. High Dark Energy is going to be good for any Pokemon. So even though I just did mention Eternatus, other Pokemon like maybe Grimmsnarl, Weavile GX, or even other just normal one prize evolution dark Pokemon can definitely benefit from something like this more than Dark City, which is also a bonus. I will briefly point out you could play this with Galarian Weezing as well. I think one of the big downsides to Galarian Weezing up until this point has been the fact that it kind of wants to be a wall Pokemon, but it doesn't have a way at free retreating. I do want to point out, I'm actually not convinced that this makes Weezing playable because we've seen strategies like that sort of fail in the past. I think the one that sticks out most to me in my head is the old Gothitelle Excelgor deck. Back when it was sort of in its infancy in the pre-Floatstone days, a lot of decks were playing copies of Darkrai EX with some copies of Dark Energy to get down on their Gothitelle to give them free retreat. You know, I even experimented with stuff like that, and I think just generally that strategy is just a little too clunky. Needing to preemptively get a dark energy down on your wall Pokemon feels kind of bad, I think. So, but overall, I'm a big fan of this card. Having free retreat is great, and there's no shortage of good dark Pokemon coming out in this set that might want to abuse something like this. So, big fan of the new special dark energy. And up next, guys, we have the final card of our Darkness Ablaze set review, and that is going to be Powerful Colorless Energy. So this says, as long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, it provides colorless energy, but when it's attached to a colorless Pokemon, their attacks do 20 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So I already did briefly mention this when talking about Salamence VMAX, just because this does kind of start to fix some of the math issues that Salamence has. But I think my big gripe with this is the fact that there's not too many attackers out there that want to attack for just colorless energy, like just a single colorless energy at that. I think that's going to be pretty uncommon. And in terms of the other just generic colorless energies, there's a bunch of other really good ones we still have in the format that this has to compete with. So think of Recycle Energy, Draw Energy, Capture Energy, etc. Now you have this one thrown into the mix, and it's definitely going to vary on a case-by-case situation, but there's a lot of competition for how you want to sort of build out your energy line. This could be a potential energy target for Porygon Z if that ever becomes a card that does better. Porygon Z, of course, has some synergy with things like Snorlax VMAX and also Salamence VMAX as well. So being able to increase their damage output is pretty good. Both those Pokemon have some sort of awkward math, so this does seem like a decent home for both of those. And if you are playing like a welder deck based around some colorless Pokemon, you can still play this in your deck with your fire energies, which is kind of cool as well. So while I like this card, I think it has a lot of competition, as I kind of mentioned already. And I'm just really not sure which of these single colorless energies are going to kind of come out on top here. So even though I'm generally kind of positive on this card, I'm going to stay more on the middle here. And with that, guys, we finally made it to the end of our Darkness Ablaze set review. I really do appreciate you guys making it all the way to the end here. I know our set reviews do tend to be a little bit long-winded, but I really do enjoy doing these in-depth discussions on all of these upcoming cards that we have. So before we close out this video, I just want to go over some of my sort of final thoughts on Darkness Ablaze as a whole. As with any set, there's always some pros and cons, and for this one, generally speaking, I think the VMAXs here are pretty decent. You know, some of the standout ones to me are, of course, Eternatus, which looks ridiculous, but also both of the Fire VMAXs look okay in the form of Centiskorch and Charizard VMAX, and even to a slightly lesser degree, Salamence VMAX as well. Needless to say, probably the most impactful thing to come out of Darkness Ablaze, though, is going to be Crobat V. Crobat V is absolutely fantastic card. I'd say easily the best card that we looked at in this set. I don't think there were too many other ones that had me even nearly as enthusiastic as Crobat. Crobat's definitely going to be a great card, even with Dedenne already in the format alongside it. And also continuing the trend that we've seen from the Sword and Shield era, we're getting more and more of these type exclusive special energies, which I think are a really cool thing for the game, all of which I think have potential, but I think probably my favorite out of the three is going to be the new special dark energy. So I think those are the things in Darkness Ablaze to get excited about. But if I had any criticism of the set, is that it's just generally kind of average. Crobat V, I think, is really the only thing that stands sort of head and shoulders above the rest of the pack in terms of all the cards that we're going to be getting. So even though this won't be my favorite set of the Sword and Shield era, I'm still looking forward to playing around with some of these new cards that we're going to be getting in Darkness Ablaze. But with that being said, though, what are your thoughts here on Darkness Ablaze? Do you agree or disagree with me? Do you think this is kind of an average set? Do you think it's better, worse than that? What are some of your favorite cards from Darkness Ablaze as well? Sound off down below in the comment section. I want to hear what you guys are thinking about Darkness Ablaze. But if you did enjoy this set review, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you can, consider supporting this channel as well by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, or by getting some merch from our online store, rarecandytcg.com. It would mean a lot. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.